got to replace them.
Honourable Members, the Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? I call the member for Clark.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, despite most of us in this place having turned our minds to the forthcoming election, it's also worth us reflecting on what's happened and been achieved in this term of Parliament. Of course, the 2022 election brought us a new federal government and, mercifully, an unprecedented number of independents. And this has undeniably helped lift the tone of the Parliament and helped ensure some good outcomes. For instance, we finally established the National Anti-Corruption Commission, something I and many others have long called for. This Parliament has also enacted some reforms on climate change, which, whilst far from perfect, were needed after 9 years of inaction by the previous government. Other notable outcomes championed by the crossbench include making the Stage 3 tax cuts fairer, reforming the aged care system and making HECS indexation more affordable for students and those with student debts. Deputy Speaker, particular highlights for me have included legislating a date to end live sheep exports, banning credit card use for gambling and busting Julian Assange out of Belmarsh Prison, all issues I have pushed hard on for many years. But we've also had our fair share of disappointments over this last 3 years, with some shocking behaviour towards each other, willful ignorance on some issues and downright gutlessness on others, not least this government's abandonment of environmental law reform and the gambling advertising ban. But, Deputy Speaker, while it shouldn't take an election to do it, I'm hoping all of us will now take the time to refocus and reprioritise the things that matter most to the community. This means standing up to big corporations and vested interests and making decisions for the benefit of our constituents. Moreover, Australians are demanding a sharper focus on the soaring cost of living, as well as the housing and health crises. It's not enough to tinker around the edges anymore and to pretend the job's been done. Australians are also desperate for improved service from the ATO, Centrelink, the NDIS and DVA. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect by their government, and to be able to trust that government services are actually there to help. Instead, too often, these systems grind on and people fall through the cracks. Deputy Speaker, what I also hear from my community and from thousands across the country is encouragement to continue pursuing meaningful political donations reform, media freedom and whistleblower reforms, gambling reform, as well as stronger action on climate change, animal welfare and a more humane treatment of asylum seekers. So, Deputy Speaker, I plan to take these priorities forward and, should the people of Clark choose me again, I will do all I can to progress them in the next Parliament. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Call the member for Macarthur.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Western Sydney Airport has the potential to transform the Macarthur area and far beyond. If you look at Macarthur on a map, you'll very quickly conclude that transport, particularly rail, is key for locals to get to and from their workplaces, job sites, schools, universities, key appointments in major city centres such as Sydney, CBD, Parramatta and Liverpool and others. Soon there will also be another major working commercial site up and running, the area of Bradfield and the soon-to-be-open Western Sydney Airport business precinct. This is an exciting opportunity for my electorate, but I'm very fearful that we might miss the boat, or in this case the train and plane, to have a rail line built to connect our region to the Aerotropolis. I've always believed that rail is the best way to connect our region, as our main roads, particularly the Northern Road, the M7, the M5, the M8, are congested already, more congested than ever before, and the proposed rapid bus service to the airport is likely to be a very slow, tortoise-like movement because of the traffic on the major linking roads. Further, having rail would enable commuters from connecting lines to link up, thereby expanding access to the airport precinct and help bolster its financial viability. The fact that past New South Wales and federal Liberal national governments did not proceed with the construction of a rail corridor from our region to Western Sydney Airport just shows just how little they focused on South West Sydney and how poorly they understand the new rapidly growing areas. I'm having constructive discussions with my federal and New South Wales Labor colleagues regarding the need for rail, and we are in fact proceeding with a scoping study about this, but I don't need a scoping study to tell me that a rail link to Western Sydney Airport is vital. I'm delighted to see also that we have been able to fund the Campbelltown Station car park upgrade that will give over 500 new spots for commuters, and I am really delighted with the announcement recently that 15th Avenue upgrades will proceed, which will improve the road links, but we need the rail. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it would have been completed sooner if they'd had a rail line to connect their workers to the site. We will complete that rail line, and it is very important to link Macarthur to a whole range of areas, including Wollondilly, Wollongong and the Illawarra, the Moorebank Intermodal, the Southern Highlands, Sydney and Kingsford Smith Airport, Northwest Sydney and Northern New South Wales and Western New South Wales. The list is endless. We must get this rail link done, and we will as a Labor government, and I'm committed to making sure this happens. So let's get the rail link to Western Sydney Airport done.
Call the member for Parks.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Basic health care is something that all Australians should have access to. And so can you imagine the frustration of a community that has had a service that no longer is available? The community of Wee Waa have been very, very angry and upset by the actions of Hunter and New England Health that have closed the Wee Waa Hospital. The emergency department closes at 5:30 every day. There's no visiting medical officer, and this hospital is largely underutilised. There's wards with beds, there's treatment rooms, everything there ready to go. Despite the the reassurances of the independent state member and the New South Wales Health Minister, there appears to be no action by Hunter and New England Health in this regard. Now, Hunter and New England Health do have form in the fact of their, I think, lack of interest in the issues and services to people, particularly in northern New South Wales. And the community of Wee Waa have been, they've been publicly protesting. They have been trying to reach out to the New South Wales government. The Narrabri Shire Council Mayor, Mayor Tiemans, has been very active in this space. And it just needs the hierarchy, the leadership of Hunter and New England Health to step out of Newcastle, go to Wee Waa and come up with a solution. There's four doctors in Wee Waa. None of them have the VMO rights at the local hospital. And we are coming up to the cotton picking season, lots of heavy machinery, lots of people working in the fields. That community, young mums having to bypass Wee Waa to go to Narrabri to have a baby. But it's not just Wee Waa. Wee Waa services a big community largely to the west, the communities of Burren Junction up to Rowena and nearly out as far as Walgett. Those people of Western New South Wales rely on that Wee Waa hospital. I'm calling on the New South Wales government, I'm calling on Hunter and New England Health to get behind the people of Wee Waa, get their skates on, hop in the car, drive to Wee Waa and fix this problem that should be very, very simply fixed just with a bit of gumption and purpose. The people of Wee Waa deserve a health service that's reliable and available, and I'm backing them in on this.
I call the member for Chisholm.
Deputy Speaker. I'm incredibly honoured and very proud to represent the wonderful community of Chisholm in this place. I will always be a champion for my community, and I'm really pleased at what we have already managed to achieve together. It was an exciting day when I attended the opening of the new headspace in my electorate, a much-needed service for the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. This joins the headspace just a few doors down from my office near Sindel Station, and it has been inspiring to meet with the staff and youth advisory groups at both of these centres, which are very loved and absolutely critical parts of the local community. The Medicare Urgent Care Clinic at 408 Huntingdale Road, Mount Waverley, is a very welcome addition to our local community, and I know one that is highly valued. A free clinic, this service provides care and reduces pressure on emergency departments. This clinic means that injuries and illnesses can be attended to quickly. I speak to people in our community all the time about the practice, and I'm struck by the incredibly positive experiences that are shared with me about the urgent care clinic. I've met with the medical staff at the clinic, and the passion, care and dedication they demonstrate is just so clear, and we are so fortunate to have such hard-working professionals serving our community in Chisholm. And I feel sick, Deputy Speaker, when I realise that this is a service that could be on the Coalition's chopping block. We know that there are definitely going to be cuts. The precise nature is secret, which is a terrible worry because you hardly ever hide good news, do you? And we know that the Coalition, and quite especially the Leader of the Opposition, has form when it comes to gutting and cutting Medicare and health services. We cannot let that happen, and I will fight it every step of the way and champion the needs of my wonderful community of Chisholm. I know from the thousands and thousands of conversations I've had door knocking and making phone calls in the electorate that action on climate change and gender equality are key issues for the voters in my terrific community in Chisholm. I'm really pleased that one of the very first acts of our government was to legislate a climate target, and we have more renewables and renewable projects than ever before. We're making substantial progress on closing the gender pay gap, and we are the first majority female government in Australia's history, which means reforms that get us closer to gender equality, such as changes to paid parental leave and a national plan to eliminate gendered violence, absolutely are supported by our government. I'm proud to be part of a government that gets things done for the nation and delivers for the community of Chisholm. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Call the member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much, Madam British Speaker. Look, now, can I say I'd like to take the opportunity to recognise and celebrate this year's Australia Day award recipients across Leichhardt. Starting with Cairns, Annie Jarrett was awarded the Citizen of the Year, and Kalia Canton has been awarded the Young Citizen of the Year. Claudio Di Bartolomeo received Volunteer of the Year, and the Bocconi family received the Lifetime Achievement Award. Lastly, in Cairns, there were 2 highly commended certificates presented to Georgina Sesto and Ella Fisher for Citizen of the Year and Young Citizen of the Year, respectively. At Port Douglas, I'd like to extend congratulations to Jenny Guyett, who has been awarded Citizen of the Year. Nate Martinelli and Harry Cobb awarded Junior and Senior Sports, respectively, Sports Awards, respectively, and Monica Prins received the Environmental Achievement Award. Nikita McDonald and Joan Vecchio have been recognised as Young Citizens of the Year and Senior Citizen of the Year, respectively. Alison George and Port Shorts has received the Arts and Culture Award, while John Scott received the Volunteer of the Year Award. The Civic Recognition Award went to Pam Wills-Burden, and lastly, a Certificate of Achievement went to Sam Carey-Sage. Now for Cookshire, where David Chappie Camholz was awarded Citizen of the Year and Sarah Few received Young Citizen of the Year. Jacinta Hunt and Jan Baddeley Smith both had awarded Volunteers of the Year, and the Sports Award was also awarded to Albert Viranchilillo. Oops, good name, Viranchilillo. The Arts and Culture Award has been awarded to Robin Sheehan, and the Environmental Award has gone to Jim Kelton. In Weipa, Shayna Reeves was awarded Citizen of the Year, and Annabelle Slingo, Young Citizen of the Year, with the Community Spirit Award went to Judy Helsler. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge the achievements of individuals in the Torres Strait. My good friend Napo Pedro Stephen AM has been awarded Citizen of the Year. Relina Hauser Workiu receives Young Citizen of the Year. The Mangrove Festival at Yam Island was recognised as an Event of the Year award. Ivor Trevelyan received the Achievement Award, while Barry Nona received the Cultural Recognition Award. Participation Awards went to Sonia Stevenson, Horace Boera and Joey Lafu. Appreciation Awards went to Carly Willis, Jennifer Onosa, Carly Lifferman, Sarah Tedder, Tally Ilu and Richard Smith Nona, and I'd like to extend my congratulations to each and every one of these individuals for right across Leichhardt. They represent the best of the far north. Their achievements and their contributions will no doubt leave lasting legacy in our respective communities. Thank you.
Call the member for Adelaide.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, I'm very proud to represent a seat, a very multicultural seat, with lots of celebrations. And this past week was an exceptional week where we celebrated the incredible Lunar New Year. And these celebrations were all across Adelaide, marking the Year of the Snake for 2025, a symbol of wisdom, transformation and resilience. Celebrations started off last week at the Julin Buddhist Association of South Australia at their temple. It was hosted by the Julin Buddhist Association. A truly remarkable celebration that thousands attended to see in the Year of the Snake at midnight. It featured fireworks, lion dances and other traditional activities. A magnificent event full of joy, full of celebration, and seeing the community celebrate the Year of the Snake and to bring in the new year was a fantastic sight. My heartfelt thanks go to Kwok Long Ha, President of the Association, and Mr Charles Tran, a Senior Committee member, for personally inviting me, as they do every year. I've been attending nearly the last 20 years this very special event. I'd also like to thank Ms Say Kapsis for her support, and of course my very good friend Stephen Chung, who's on the committee on and off over the last 20 years, who's always a fixture at this particular event. The Chinese New Year dinner also was celebrated at the Adelaide Zoo, which was hosted by the Premier and the Honourable Consul General of China. And the highlight of the event, which made it even more special, was the arrival of two giant pandas, Xing Chu and Yi Lan. These majestic animals to the Adelaide Zoo, which are now available for public viewing, perfectly complemented the Lunar New Year festivities, adding harmony and cultural significance. A special thank you to the Consul General, Mr. Li Dong, Consul General of China, for making this possible for us, and for his hard work together with the Premier of South Australia, getting exports back into China together with Minister for Trade, Don Farrell, and he should be recognised for the enormous work that he's done together with the federal government and the state government in South Australia. On top of that, on the weekend, we had the Vietnamese community in Australia. The SA chapter hosted the Tet Festival with the theme Home Away from Home. And this year marks 50 years since South Australia welcomed the Vietnamese boat people, a resilient community that has done so well. They've overcome adversity to enrich our nation. Their contributions not only benefit the Vietnamese Australians, but they enrich the lives of all Australians. So, Deputy Speaker, this weekend we have the Chinatown Lunar New Year street party in my electorate, and I'm looking forward to attending that in Chinatown in the federal seat of Adelaide. It promises to be another vibrant celebration, and may the Year of the Snake bring health, happiness and prosperity.
Has expired. I call the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to speak about the remarkable community spirit in Bradfield, the electorate that I've been privileged to represent in this place for 15 years. Last Saturday, as one manifestation of that community spirit, the Killara Rural Fire Service Station opened. This has been the culmination of many years of work and planning to establish the new Killara Rural Fire Brigade in 2017 and to build this magnificent new station in Coolah Avenue in East Killara, opposite Killara High School. I particularly congratulate Deputy Captain and Brigade President Stuart Clark, who's worked for many years to achieve this outcome, as well as Brigade Captain Andrew Wilson and all of the volunteers who serve in the Rural Fire Service, not just the Killara Brigade, but locally also the Ku-ring-gai Brigade, and of course all of the other volunteer firefighters across New South Wales and across Australia. Late last year, I held my annual Bradfield Community Christmas Drinks, and we recognised 3 outstanding local organisations and asked each of them to brief the assembled group of over 100 people on the great work that they do. We heard from Liz Howell of Lifeline Harbour to Hawkesbury. There's a very big facility that they have in Gordon in the electorate of Bradfield, and as the name suggests, they serve people from the harbour up to the Hawkesbury River and beyond, including a lot of counsellors who work on the enormously valuable Lifeline telephone counselling service, and I've heard from many of them stories about people who they've helped, people who are in considerable distress and in some cases considering ending their own lives. We also heard at this event from Kevin Howe, a very impressive young man in my electorate who's just finished Year 12 with outstanding results, but while he was at high school he founded an organisation called Youth for Difference, which has attracted large numbers of high school students to volunteer for a whole range of important causes. And indeed, I joined them last year along with Giselle Capterian, the then Liberal candidate for North Sydney, now the Liberal candidate for Bradfield. We joined them at a community barbecue at Bunnings in support of the Danny Foundation, which works to deal with the scourge of diabetes and early onset diabetes. And we also heard at my Christmas event just before Christmas from Fran Signorelli of Hope in a Suitcase. This is a wonderful volunteer organisation which prepares suitcases full of personal items, clothing and toys for children who are going into foster care and often finding themselves in a situation where they have very few or no personal effects with them. So I do want to acknowledge all of these wonderful volunteers and the many other volunteer organisations across the electorate of Bradfield. Thank you for the work you do to make our community a more fortunate place and the help that you give so many others.
I call the Minister for Skills and Training.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. As I stand here in Australia's Parliament, hundreds are gathering at the Transfiguration of our Lord, Thomastown Greek Orthodox Church. They're gathering in solemn mourning, in remembrance and in celebration of an extraordinary life, that of my friend, Sophia Mastoris OAM. It is fitting that she be remembered in this place as well as in the community that she served. The Scullen community and I have lost a dear friend and a dear comrade in the passing of Sophia. I recognise that she was a member of the Labor Party of 43 years, amongst many other very significant accomplishments. If it is impossible, as I believe, to imagine Melbourne today without the extraordinary imprint of the Greek Australian community, it's impossible to overstate the influence of Sophia on that community, particularly in the northern suburbs, and particularly in terms of her work with Greek women. She dedicated her life to empowering women in the Greek community. In particular, in her role as president of the Hellenic Women's Federation, she worked tirelessly and effectively to advocate for Greek heritage. She was also a deeply impressive advocate for the Cancer Council and promoted cancer services for many years after her own breast cancer surgery. She never stopped. She always showed kindness and compassion for others and was a very regular and much loved visitor to my electorate office. I and my staff will miss her terribly. She was a strong advocate, a leader and an inspiration for the community. And as I stand here wishing I could be at the funeral itself, I send my condolences to her family. I note that Sophia is survived by her son Nonda and beloved grandchildren and remembered by many who loved her across the community. And Deputy Speaker, last weekend I had the very great privilege of cutting the ribbon to officially open Leading Edge Childcare and Early Learning in Wollert, a fantastic family-owned business bringing something very special to a growing community. And I want to send out a very special thank you to the owners for inviting me to be part of this event, but to the families who I spoke with over a very enjoyable sausage sizzle on a hot day, a magic show and some very impressive tricks by my good mate Bruce, who's far better with balloon animals and rabbits than I could ever pretend to be. I've been visiting childcare centres right across my electorate, from the Good Start in Mill Park to Great Beginnings in Epping, meeting with so many dedicated and hard-working childcare workers and early educators, just like Priya from Great Beginnings, who spoke with passion about seeing the growth within our young ones, the difference that they make in shaping young lives and our future, ensuring that everyone gets the best start in life. And I remind the House that the Albanese government deeply understands the importance of this vital sector. That's why, of course, we're delivering a 15% wage increase for early childhood educators and working to entrench early education as a fundamental part of our education system.
I want to acknowledge and pass on my best wishes to the multiple Australia Day Award winners of the Medal of the Order of Australia. First congratulations goes to Trish Nichols, a Foster local, for her services to basketball as an accomplished statistician, including the statistics involved in the Sydney Olympics and other many world events. Also, Laurelton resident Adele Whelan, with over 50 years' experience and services to Little Athletics through administrative roles. I'd like to recognise Great Lakes local Julie Brady for her service to the community through social welfare organisations, particularly establishing a women's shelter and providing a safe haven for women and children escaping domestic violence. A posthumous award went to the late Roger Lynch, who passed away in 2021, for his services to the Great Lakes region, not only just as an accountant and businessman, but also in many community sports. A well-deserved award, and the award was accepted by his wife, Jan. Also, Ken Cameron of Marlee for his contribution of services to the Rural Fire Service and the Marlee community over many years. The Emergency Services Medal was awarded to Julie Wilcox of Foster. And a Conspicuous Service Cross in the Military Awards has been awarded to Wing Commander Benjamin Sawley of Luscantire for his outstanding service as Commanding Officer of the No. 1 Flying Training School of the Royal Australian Air Force. I'd also like to congratulate Warhope Bowling Club President Rick Simpson and all the members for their $1,000 donation supporting the Warhope District Memorial Hospital, and the Kendall Tennis Club, who supplied another 6 ball kits for the prestigious United Cup, an international teams tournament held December 27 to 5th of January in Sydney and Perth. Trevor Coles, 76 years young, is the most senior competitive cricket player in the Camden Haven, and he played for the New South Wales Cricket over 70s division second side when they won the national championship. Joel Fleming of the Foster Aquatic Club competed in the South Australian State Open, making the finals of all events, and it was heartbreaking to hear of the Laurelton Fishermen's Co-op, which was destroyed by fire recently. The cause is still unknown at this stage while police investigations continue. On the upside, many community events have been organised to help the displaced fishermen whose livelihoods are in jeopardy, whilst plans are being worked on the rebuilding and the reconstruction of the co-op, which had been operating since 1946. For all of those who have contributed to help the Fishermen's Co-op get up and running, I salute you. That's what makes the Lion electorate such a strong community.
I call the member for Lyons.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, last week I had the pleasure of joining the Rotary Club of Westbury for its annual Australia Day breakfast and was accompanied by federal Lions candidate Rebecca White, my good friend. Every year, Westbury Rotary members host a breakfast at the local RSL, all in the aim of connecting community over a meal and raising money for great causes. This year, the event was supported by both the Australian Government and the Meander Valley Council, and more than 120 people enjoyed breakfast, with thousands raised for District Governor Pam Scott OAM's campaign to end family violence. I was delighted to lend a hand at the juice station, a position I've taken up for many years, and it was great to see the community come together to enjoy each other's company and celebrate our wonderful country. A huge shout out to everybody who made the day possible, including Westbury Rotary President Carol Wood and Secretary Andrew Wood. Thank you also to club members and friends, Graham Dent, Annette Barrett, Tracy Lee, Beryl Pern, Amanda Taylor, Dinah Fitzgerald, Barry Pern, Harley Nichols, Miles Irving, Doug Polton, Malcolm French, Miles Kerr, Ben Dudman, Florida Rickard, Joe Fitzgerald, Martin Wilson, Russell Whitcomb, Judy Kilby, Matthew Godfrey and Anne-Marie Loader, all of whom woke up before dawn to make sure breakfast was hot and ready from 7:30 a.m. And Deputy Speaker, I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate 11 Lions constituents who received recognition in this year's Australia Day honours. Congratulations to Duncan Kerr SC, former Attorney General of Australia, a former Federal Court judge and my boss in a previous life, who was appointed as an Officer of the Order. Congratulations to Denise Talbot, David Downey, Reverend Josephine Pycroft, David Gatenby and Dr James Marcus, who were all appointed members of the Order of Australia for their service to the nation and to the Tasmanian community in their respective fields. And congratulations also to Catherine McDonald, who was awarded the Public Service Medal, Andrew Skelly, Catherine Gillam and Adam Jones for the Australian Fire Service Medal, and Curtis Salter for the Emergency Services Medal. Congratulations, Deputy Speaker, to all Tasmanians across Tasmania who were recognised with honours at the national, state and municipal level for their wonderful service to their communities and to their nation. The country thanks you.
In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded and I call the clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 1, Criminal Code Amendment, Hate Crimes Bill 2024, resumption of debate on second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time and I call the member for Hughes in continuation.
And Deputy Speaker, similarly, neither did I. So if we turn to the purpose of this legislation, its stated purpose is to extend the existing offences for urging force or violence and for displaying hate symbols, and to introduce new offences for threatening force or violence against targeted groups and their members. And Deputy Speaker, I've already stated that this legislation has become necessary and we are seeking some amendments to make this legislation even stronger in force, is because of the dreadful attacks that we have seen on Australian Jewish people. They're attacked simply because of their Jewish faith ancestry, and it is completely unacceptable. And if we return, Deputy Speaker, to what seems to have inflamed the situation that we've had in Australia, the initial spark of the anti-Semitic attacks that we are now seeing across our country came with the 7th of October terrorist attacks on Israel by the recognised terrorist group Hamas. And Deputy Speaker, there can be no equivocation or denial on this. The October 7 attacks are the single greatest loss of Jewish lives on any day since the Holocaust. October 7 was a day of murder, torture, kidnapping and brutal sexual violence perpetuated by Hamas against Jews in Israel. The attack was deliberately cruel and barbaric. And we don't need to repeat the heinous acts in this chamber, but there is no doubt they were designed with the purpose of maximising pain and sorrow amongst Jewish people. And it also involved taking over 100 people hostage, many of whom have still not been released, more than a year after the first attacks. And what we saw in this country, Deputy Speaker, is that bad actors here rejoiced in the day that was marked by the murder, torture, sexual assault and kidnapping of innocent Israelis. And Deputy Speaker, I have called out in this chamber before members of the left in Labor, in the Labor Party, as well as members of the Greens Party, who usually would be calling out acts of violence against women. There was no call, particularly by the Australian Greens Party, for the hostages to be released. There were calls for a ceasefire. And Deputy Speaker, the reality is there was a ceasefire. On the 6th of October 2023, there was a ceasefire. What alternative did Israel have but to go and get back her citizens? And here in Australia, Deputy Speaker, if that attack had occurred here, I would fully expect my government to instruct the military to go and return Australians, whether they be family members or friends or other Australians, because these were innocent civilians who were taken by a terrorist organisation on that day, and it is completely shameful that most members of the Labor Party and all members of the Greens have failed to call that out. So what we have seen as a result, Deputy Speaker, a lack of leadership shown from the very top, from the Prime Minister of our country. Why is this legislation before the House today? Because it has come about due to the Prime Minister's failure to lead on this issue. From day one, he refused to admit or speak about anti-Semitism unless he also mentioned Islamophobia and other discrimination at the same time. Now, Deputy Speaker, the attack on the Israeli people on October the 7th was nothing but an anti-Semitic attack, and it defies belief that the Prime Minister of this country was unable to call it that. Other leaders throughout the world were able to. They showed strong leadership, Deputy Speaker. What we have seen from this Prime Minister and from most, not all, members of the government has been a complete silence and complete weakness about anti-Semitism in this country and the anti-Semitism that occurred on October the 7th that originally gave rise to that. He should have made very clear through his actions from the very beginning that those who sought to spread anti-Semitic attacks in Australia would feel the full force of the law. He didn't. He could and should have been clear about the scale of the horror inflicted by Hamas and that Australia stands with its long-term friend and ally, Israel. The Prime Minister could and should have used our laws and our police forces to clamp down on those who sought to weaponise the Hamas attacks for their own hateful purposes here at home. And Deputy Speaker, I have a friend. His name's Simon. He lives in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. He's Jewish. His 4-year-old daughter walks to preschool accompanied by 2 armed guards. That is not and should not be the Australia of 2025, but that's the reality. Jewish students don't wear their school uniform in public. Jewish students on university campuses have been subject to violent attacks. They've been subject to, other Jewish people have been subject to doxing for simply being part of a WhatsApp group. And this is completely unacceptable. If this was happening to any other group of Australians, the Prime Minister the Foreign Minister, the Labor Party and the Greens Party would have been calling this out, and instead they haven't. And when we had, for example, in the Prime Minister's own home state, New South Wales, we had an angry mob on the 9th of October standing outside the Opera House and chanting, "Where's the Jews?" or whatever they were saying. He was silent. We saw Jewish shops being vandalised, Jewish students being harassed, and roaming gangs in places like Caulfield in Victoria hunting for Jews. This is in 2023 and 2024, Deputy Speaker. This is not Germany in the 1930s. I never thought I would see this in my lifetime. I agree with the member for Wannon when he used those words as well. So, Deputy Speaker, at a time when we are responding to an unprecedented wave of anti-Semitism here in our country, when we are seeing armed guards outside Jewish schools, it is completely appropriate that we do focus on anti-Semitism. The Prime Minister did not do that, and his failure to do so was an indication that he did not take the threat of anti-Semitism seriously. And Deputy Speaker, in my electorate of Hughes in southern Sydney and southwest Sydney, I have less than 1,000 Jewish Australians in my electorate. However, the very silent but very large majority of people that I've spoken to in my electorate, when I've been out door knocking, when I've conducted mobile offices, through emails, they say that they are absolutely horrified at the Prime Minister's silence on this issue. And they will very shortly get an opportunity to express to this Prime Minister and his government just how unhappy they are. Because a Prime Minister that doesn't defend his nation, that doesn't stand up for a group of Australians, is not worthy of being the Prime Minister, Deputy Speaker. So the existing laws that we do have existing criminal laws that are meant to deal with things like the urging of violence against groups defined by either race or religion, and this is in Division 80 of the Criminal Code. These laws were not used. Why not? Protests in our streets in which anti-Semitic displays abounded were permitted to drag on for months and months and months. Universities were permitted to be used as encampments that served as a hotbed of anti-Semitic action. Our human rights institutions were not given focus or direction, nor called to account when they abandoned the Jewish community. The Prime Minister's response for months and months and months, for over a year, was what we can only call drowsy and disinterested. Through his actions, Prime Minister Albanese sent a very clear message that despite what he might say, there will be no real consequences for those who target and attack Jewish Australians. This was a green light for anti-Semites. He's also, the government that he leads, has also abandoned Israel on the international stage. In the wake of October 7, the instinct of the Labor government was not to stand with Israel, which had just been the target of an horrific atrocity. It was to call on Israel to exercise restraint. This was followed by a series of votes in the United Nations in which Australia, under the leadership of this Prime Minister, reversed a long-standing bipartisan position on Israel. The Foreign Minister, Minister Wong, went to Israel and yet refused to go and have a look at the scene of the initial massacre. Why? Why would she do that? She is meant to be there as our Foreign Minister representing us on the international stage. I similarly say that that the Foreign Minister is not worthy by her actions of continuing to hold that position. So, Deputy Speaker, while I do commend the changes in this legislation, I still say this legislation has come far too late, and it reflects the fact that the Prime Minister has been asleep at the wheel on this issue of anti-Semitism.
And I thank the member for Hughes for her contribution. The question before the Federation Chamber is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. It is, as the member for Hughes has just said, too little, too late when it comes to this legislation and the broader issue of dealing with the scourge of rising anti-Semitism occurring in our country since the Hamas terror attacks on the 7th of October 2023. Make no mistake, this bill is necessary because of the repeated failures of the Albanese government. The Prime Minister has been stoking tensions over the past 16 months through his weak leadership and failure to act decisively to stamp out anti-Semitism. He has been missing in action on this very, very important issue. This is all about leadership, or the lack thereof. Australians look to their Prime Minister to set the tone of the national response to any crisis. The Prime Minister should have made clear through his actions from the very beginning that those who sought to spread anti-Semitic attacks here would feel the full force of the law. He should have been clear from the very beginning about the scale of the horror inflicted by Hamas and underscored Australia's allegiance to its long-term friend and ally, Israel. He could and should have used our laws and our police forces to clamp down on those who sought to weaponise the Hamas attacks for their own hateful purposes here at home. He did not. At a time when we were seeing an unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism, the Prime Minister and his ministers failed to acknowledge the presence of anti-Semitism without concurrently mentioning Islamophobia, always seeking a moral equivalence. Neither have a place in this country. Both are condemned. But acknowledging Jewish Australians' experiences of anti-Semitism does not diminish the experience of Muslim Australians. The Prime Minister did not address this, and his failure to do so was an indication that he did not take the threat of anti-Semitism seriously. We saw ongoing failures to take decisive action against anti-Semitism in Australia. Anti-Semitic displays were not prosecuted, protests were not stopped, and universities were permitted to be used as encampments. Worse still, the tone was set incorrectly from October 2023, when police arrested a man carrying an Israeli flag in Sydney during protests supporting Palestine, allegedly for his own safety. Offensive references to Jewish people were made at the same protest, which to this day continue to be debated and forensically examined as to what was actually said. Existing criminal laws that are meant to deal with things like the urging of violence against groups defined by race or religion in Division 80 of the Criminal Code were not used. Hence, anti-Semitic sentiment was allowed to fester. Through the Prime Minister's actions, or conversely inactions, the Prime Minister sent a very clear message that despite what he might say, there would be no real consequences for those who target and attack Jewish Australians. Because of this Prime Minister's inaction, we are now experiencing acts of outright terrorism, firebombing of cars, targeting of homes, childcare centres, synagogues, including the horrific attack on the Adass Israel Synagogue in Melbourne in December. And most recently, the finding of a caravan packed with explosives and an alleged anti-Semitic plot to attack several Jewish targets. In Australia, in 2025, who on earth would have thought this could be? This is now a clear campaign of terror and is not something I would ever have imagined happening in our lucky country, a place where for generations migrants have come across the seas to find safety, opportunity and a chance to live a better life. This is not the Australia we know and love. Attacks on Jewish Australians are attacks on our way of life. attacks on every Australian. Attacking people because of their Jewish faith and ancestry is un-Australian. Under Labor, the Jewish community now feels under siege and abandoned. This abandonment traces back not only in the Prime Minister and his government's failure to take decisive action, but also in the diplomatic abandonment of Israel, the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. This government has overturned a decades-long bipartisan position on Israel in our foreign policy, as evidenced by voting patterns at the United Nations. On the international stage, Australia appeared to reward Hamas's terrorist attacks. Diplomatic abandonment has been coupled with a weak stance on border security, including the provision of visas to thousands of people from Gaza, a war zone ruled by a listed terrorist organisation, many without proper security checks. People on visas who sympathise with terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah should be deported today. Those fleeing Gaza or Lebanon should be turned back if they are terrorist sympathisers. They do not have a place in this country. This failure of decisive action as a leader is a leader in crisis. In the application of existing laws, the diplomatic abandonment of Israel and weak stance on border security all can only be for perceived local political gain. The Albanese government is more concerned with winning votes in Western Sydney and appeasing voters in inner city electorates than on ensuring the protection of Jewish people in Australia and maintaining our values and way of life. If you might forgive a brief digression, Deputy Speaker, we see the same callous political games played with regional Australians. To save their seats in inner cities from the Greens, Labor is railroading regional communities with a radical rollout of wind turbine solar panels and 28,000 kilometres of transmission lines for a political target. My point is that this Prime Minister lacks the leadership to govern for all Australians and act in the national interest. Anti-Semitism is inconsistent with Australian values and unthinkable in modern Australia. Australia must reject anti-Semitism, as it must reject the persecution of any group on the basis of religion or race. Jewish people have been persecuted persistently over history, and the recent 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on the 27th of January 2025 reminds us of the horrors of the Holocaust, with the death of some 6 million Jews, a circumstance that all agree must never be repeated. Former Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard told a Sky News documentary earlier this year, and I quote, "Many of the anti-Israel demonstrations have been caused by a distortion of history. It's a misunderstanding about how Israel came into existence. It's a misunderstanding about the nature of the conflict. And because of that, I think particularly young people are developing views about this which are unbalanced and really not informed by history in any way." Ms. Gillard went on to say poignantly, and I quote, "The Holocaust, of course, teaches us where anti-Semitism leads if it's not confronted. That is the history of Germany before the war. It didn't happen all at once. These things happened a step at a time." So given we've seen that history, we're in a position when we see the first few steps to say no, no more. Let's start combating that now, rather than watch this history just play out, end quote. Bearing that in mind, what sort of lifestyle should Jewish Australians and those of any other religious or cultural group expect? Rights and freedoms for all individuals? Freedom of thought, worship, speech and association? Rule of law, safety, justice? Equality of opportunity, reward for effort and a fair go? At least that's what this coalition believes in. Yet Labor's inaction is tearing our social cohesion apart. Anti-Semitism is like a wound that festers within communities. Without appropriate treatment, it grows and causes destruction of the surrounding tissue, eroding community connections, relationships and values, pitting neighbours against each other. While people in Mallee, my electorate, might think this is an urban issue, the reality is that I've been made aware of anti-Semitism in my own electorate. This is not only an issue in inner city areas where there are many Jewish people living in close proximity to each other, but also in rural and regional communities. In small rural and regional communities, people often know each other and rely heavily on their social networks and connections, making festering anti-Semitism even more volatile. Jewish people in Mallee tell me they don't feel safe due to open anti-Semitism in the Australian community, including the display of blatantly anti-Semitic propaganda in public spaces within my rural and regional electorate. An Italian migrant complained to me recently that his family came to Australia in the 1950s and accepted Australian values. Why can't newer arrivals? The ability to understand and subscribe to Australian values is essential for social cohesion and maintaining our way of life. I reiterate the concern expressed by Victoria Police about rising anti-Semitism in Victoria. The Victorian Chief Commissioner recently articulated this by saying, and I quote, "We've seen a significant rise in anti-Semitism. It remains our biggest concern." Commissioner Patton said that since the October 7 attack, more than 160 anti-Semitic incidents have been reported in Victoria. Accordingly, an increased police presence is now being deployed in Melbourne. Unfortunately, it does not seem this will extend to the regions. Evil is always present, gently bubbling beneath the surface, and strong action must be taken to ensure it doesn't start to simmer, let alone boil. To further illustrate the fact that anti-Semitism is not just an issue in the cities, I highlight an instance of blatant public activity by a white supremacist group in Mallee in 2021, where a group of about 30 men were seen performing Nazi salutes and chanting slogans such as "White Power" and "Heil Hitler" while camping and hiking in a national park. The mind boggles. This bill is intended to help mitigate some of the government's failures. It modifies the existing offences in Division 80 of the Criminal Code that should have been used to stop the spark of anti-Semitism in the first place. The existing offences in Division 80 of the Criminal Code make it an offence to urge violence against individuals or groups on the basis of race, religion and the like. They make it an offence to advocate terrorism or genocide. For months, the Coalition has been calling for the existing laws to be used. We have been saying that the existing offences should be tested and those preaching anti-Semitism should be put before a court. Why hasn't this happened? Regardless, the changes made by these laws, as introduced, are welcome. I only hope they will be enough to start to stem the tide. Inaction is no longer acceptable. The scourge of anti-Semitism in this country, must be stopped.
And I think the member for Mallee, the question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I congratulate the member for Mallee on her fine speech that she's just given, and I support the remarks that she's made. Mr Deputy Speaker, both sides of this House agree that our country is facing significant challenges when it comes to anti-Semitism and the breakdown in social cohesion. The Director-General of Security, in his 2024 threat assessment, warned the country of this growing threat. The previous coalition government invested in efforts to counter violent extremism and address the root causes and vehicles of radicalisation with strong leadership on online safety, education and mental health care. What was Labor's response? What has been this government's response? A divisive, race-based referendum, funding for divisive organisations, and a systematic campaign against Israel and the Jewish people. Oh, they have, however, created a position of a special envoy for social cohesion. Now, I've got nothing against the member for Wills. The member for Wills is a good bloke. But in this position, this is typical of what this Prime Minister does. A bit of wallpaper, a fresh coat of paint, and there's nothing to see here because he does these things, creates positions like the Special Envoy for Social Cohesion to make out as though he's actually doing something when he's doing nothing. Or worse, he's actually making the problem worse by his actions and his inactions. Now, the Attorney-General said that this Labor government is committed to the safety and security of the community. Tell that to the people of Alice Springs. Tell that to the Australian Border Force. Tell that to victims of knife crime, of child exploitation and domestic violence who are paying the price for Labor's careless cuts and clueless government. Tell that to Jewish students. Tell that to the people, the Jewish community who frequent synagogues. Tell that to Jewish shop owners across the country. In introducing this bill, the member for Isaacs said no one in Australia should be targeted because of who they are or what they believe. And that goes to the heart of this issue. The reality is that Australia is facing an anti-Semitism crisis in which Jewish people and the Israeli diaspora are targeted because of who they are. They are targeted online and in the street through doxing and abuse simply because of where they come from or what they believe. This is Australia in 2025. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm going to hazard a guess that neither you, certainly not I, would have thought, even 2 years ago, that we would be here where we are today. Scratch that very thin veneer, and what we are seeing today is the worst kind of racial vilification, the oldest kind of racial vilification. And it is up to every member of this House and the Senate and across the states and territories, all leaders in the community, and in fact every single Australian, to call out anti-Semitism when and as we see it. Now, a tactic that is currently being used by the government is that the opposition is somehow politicising this issue. But nothing could be further from the truth. What is an opposition to do when it sees a total, fundamental failure on the part of government in relation to its policies? Should an opposition just say, oh, well, you know, we don't want to politicise this, we don't want to create an issue here, we don't want to draw any attention to the failures of government? No. No. It's up to every single Australian to call out the failures of this government. And they are. This is not a Jewish problem. This is a problem that is impacting upon 27 million Australians. I have a very small Jewish community in my electorate. The Sunshine Coast, whilst the Jewish community is growing, reportedly in the order of around 1,000 people. It's very small. But I am having people everyday, ordinary Australians, non-Jewish people, coming to me, stopping me in the street and saying, what is happening to Jews in Australia is unforgivable. This is not the Australia that we know and love. The crazies on the left, the crazies on the far left, I should say, the crazies on the far right seem to have created this confluence of unforgivable behaviour. And it is up to every single one, every single Australian to call it out as we see it. Make no mistake, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this hate speech, this hate has a new lick of paint, rebranded, and it's a campaign that is called, in inverted commas, Zionism. But make no mistake, they are the same ancient tropes, lies and attitudes that have been repackaged to attack the Jewish people, as they have for thousands of years. I think we need to be really clear about what Zionism is. It is clarity and definition which this legislation is supposed to provide, after all. Now, UK TV personality and Holocaust educator Rachel Riley put it really well. She said, and I'll quote, "Zionism is the belief that Jews have the right to self-determination in their own nation-state." She continued, "Anti-Zionism, in its proper definition, says that Jews alone in the world should not have their own nation-state." Let's look at what this anti-Jewish hate, by its many names, has led to in this country since the October 7 attacks. Stores run by Jewish people have been vandalised. Nazi symbols and anti-Semitic vandalism has been spray painted and carved into public spaces, including in Sippy Downs. And Batinia, in my own community, right at the very outside concrete of my office. Violent protests have spread from national monuments to regional towns, replete with terrorist slogans, the flags of hate groups and the portraits of dictators. School students, university students and academics have been targeted through protests, encampments, discrimination and hate-filled conferences, including at local schools and my own alma mater at QUT. Now, I recently called on the Education Minister to stop funding QUT until an investigation was done on their actions in the most heinous conference that was supposed to have been one driving social cohesion. Absolutely disgraceful. Not only are the people that ran and spoke at that conference, not only should they be condemned, but the leadership of QUT, where I did my law degree, they should be condemned. This government needs to muscle up and put its money where its mouth is and start taking action against organisations that drive anti-Semitism, like the Queensland University of Technology. Last year, we saw the Adass Israel Synagogue firebombed in Melbourne in scenes that were reminiscent of the Kristallnacht in November 1938. This year, unforgivably, a childcare centre in Sydney near a Jewish school and synagogue was torched. Now, that childcare centre was not a Jewish-run childcare centre. It just happened to be near a synagogue and a Jewish school. And thanks to the efforts of law enforcement and intelligence agencies, a catastrophic terror attack was prevented in Sydney last week. that potential terrorist attack, well, that had the potential to be the worst domestic terrorism event in Australian history, reportedly with enough explosives to have had a 40-metre blast zone, almost the length of a 50-metre Olympic swimming pool. Inside that caravan was a list of Jewish synagogues and Jewish sites. Now, I do congratulate Chris Minns and the New South Wales Police Force on their work in relation to this. But the leadership of our political leadership and our senior police and law enforcement agencies' leadership has been left wanting. And it has been left wanting since October 9, when we saw those disgraceful scenes on the steps of Sydney Opera House that were left unchecked. And when these things get left unchecked, it becomes a progressive series of events where people think that they can get away with something and they'll keep pushing the envelope, pushing, until we start to see the firebombing of synagogues and childcare centres. There is a very real risk that someone will be killed as a result of these appalling anti-Semitic actions. And it's all very well and good for the Prime Minister to make mealy-mouthed comments. But what we have seen is a systemic attack on Israel and the Jewish people, which has fuelled this anti-Semitism in Australia. The government can't have it both ways. The Prime Minister can't stand up and say, oh, he's doing all these wonderful things, and then lead the charge in the United Nations against Israel. That is unacceptable. Israel is our ally. It is the only democracy in the Middle East. And Australia, the Australian government, has abandoned Israel. We are seeing insidious neo-Nazi extremism moving from the dark recesses of the internet onto regularly used apps and web platforms, and indeed now onto our streets. I think above all things, this is a crisis in leadership from a government which has systematically, as I said, campaigned against Israel and the Jewish people. Alongside the Leader of the Opposition, the Shadow Foreign Minister and my good friend, the Member for Barara, I outlined yesterday many of Labor's failures. But I note that in his second reading speech, the Attorney-General only references anti-Semitism once, and only in tandem with Islamophobia. For many months, Labor ministers have proven incapable of acknowledging the scourge of domestic anti-Semitism without mentioning Islamophobia, as if one somehow offsets the other. Yes, people of all faiths are contending with a rise in extremism. The Islamic community, the Christian community, Hindu, Sikh, minority faith groups are all paying the price for Labor's social cohesion crisis. This legislation is an important step forward, but it is too little too late. That should be the slogan of Labor's approach in office. Too little, too late.
Has expired. And I thank the member for Fisher. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. You know, I confess that as a member of the 47th Parliament, I can't help but feel the incredible weight that comes with debating what is quite an extraordinary piece of legislation in our nation's history. To think our society has reached a point that we must put in place laws to protect individuals and groups from hate speech is a very sad indictment on the direction in which we are headed. Yet here we are. And as the person the community of North Sydney sent to Parliament to represent them during this term, hear me when I say, The people who surround me in my community every day share a common belief that all of us have the right to feel safe, to be treated with respect, and to participate in our society without fear of vilification and discrimination based on our individual characteristics. And if realising that ambition means we need to move laws like this, then we will support that legislation wholeheartedly. At the end of the day, however, we will also ensure our day-to-day actions are driven by common values that are not just practiced to ensure we stay within the boundaries of the law, but are practically lived on a daily basis to ensure everyone feels included. We will also continue to work to bring those that are currently outliers to this ambition back into line, even as we are called woke. Because much to all our shame, there are people currently living in Australia who are subject to hate speech and vilification. To quote the Human Rights Law Centre, far-right hate and extremism is on the rise. Women wearing the hijab have been assaulted by men in the street, while men wearing the kippah have been met with the white power salute. We've seen rallies held against trans rights and neo-Nazis intimidating refugee activists. This cannot continue. Most recently, it has been heartbreaking to see so many disgusting instances of blatant anti-Semitism targeting Jewish businesses, individuals and places of worship. These acts are abhorrent and there is absolutely no place for them in this country. In this context, then, it's clear we need stronger measures to prevent and address hate crimes in Australia. And while I can wish that it had not been necessary, I believe this legislation will certainly play a valuable role in our overall response to this challenge. But as we've heard from human rights organisations and community groups, it cannot be our only response. In addition to these changes to hate speech laws in the bill before us, there is also a clear need for measures which not only address actual violence, but ultimately stop vilification of certain groups before it even begins. There's also a clear need for a long-term national anti-racism framework in Australia, including a national hate crimes database and greater funding for the prevention of extremism, because ultimately, if we can't name it and track it, we will never be able to adequately understand where it comes from or what is driving it. Informing all of these responses then is a need for a national human rights framework that ensures hate speech and discrimination laws and policies are grounded in a common, irrefutable and legislated understanding of minimum human rights for all. The bill before us then broadens the offences for urging violence against either members of specific groups or entire groups themselves to include groups distinguished by sex, sexual orientation, gender identity and disability. It would also broaden this offence to capture recklessness rather than just intent and remove the availability of the good faith defence. The bill does this by creating a new offence for directly threatening force or violence towards a group or a group member. And finally, the bill would expand the existing offences against the public display of Nazi terrorist symbols used to humiliate or intimidate a group to include groups distinguished by sex, sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, many of these measures have been being advocated for a very long time from a broad cross-section of our society, including advocates for the LGBTQAI+ community and more recently the Jewish community. I thank the government for finally heeding that advocacy and bringing this reform into law. But at the same time, I'm concerned the bill doesn't do enough to adequately address the threats faced by a multitude of communities. Particular concern has been raised around the absence of an offence that specifically targets serious vilification of protected groups. As one North Sydney resident expressed to me, and I quote, "The current bill won't protect me or other LGBTQIA+ people against serious vilification. The promotion of hatred that can be the spark which leads to violence will not be stopped. We need stronger, broader protections that operate nationally to protect all of us, including other communities impacted by prejudice-motivated speech and violence." In this context, then, I will be supporting the amendments to be moved by the member for Wentworth that would create a new criminal offence for public acts performed with the intention and likely outcome of promoting hatred towards a targeted person or group. Her amendment would close a current potential loophole where a person hasn't explicitly urged violence but is nonetheless engaging in serious vilification. And I recognise this as potentially quite an extraordinary inclusion in a piece of legislation. I think we're living in extraordinary times in which extraordinary actions are required. The amendment she's moving has been advocated for strongly by Equality Australia and supported in principle by the Human Rights Commission. In considering all of these approaches to tackling hatred and discrimination, however, I share the caution of many human rights groups that legislation targeting hate crimes must be carefully calibrated to ensure we avoid over-policing and or inadvertently capturing the legitimate exercise of freedom of expression. In the case of this legislation, then, we've heard criticism from certain groups that the legislation doesn't take enough care in weighing up competing human rights. For instance, the report of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, of which I'm a member, noted that it's currently unclear whether this bill's limitations on the rights to freedom of expression, religion and non-discrimination would be proportionate in all circumstances. The committee further highlights the risk that in practice these offences could capture a range of conduct, the prohibition of which may constitute an unjustifiable limit on the rights to freedom of expression. These concerns extend to the removal of the good faith defence, which would eliminate any legal recourse for individuals who fall foul of this law. The Australian Human Rights Commission questions whether expressive speech during unpopular or divisive public protests could be viewed as incitement against protected groups. And if yes, legislation such as this could disproportionately impact groups that engage in protest to have their voices heard, such as First Nations people. Given this concern, while I ultimately support this bill, I also believe it's imperative that we're able to answer these questions as they are reflective of a recurring problem that we have in Australian lawmaking as we struggle to weigh up the freedom of expression against the right to safety, the freedom from discrimination to other rights. And while I acknowledge much of what is included here in the Member for Wentworth's amendment is already in practice in WA, I would assert that applying this thinking from the federal level down warrants a degree of certainty for those whose primary concern is the protection of free speech. Ultimately, I also can't help but take this opportunity to again assert that many of the concerns that have prompted the introduction of this legislation today would be avoided if we had a Federal Human Rights Act. As one of the only developed nations in the world not to have a Human Rights Act, we continue to be hamstrung by a piecemeal system that relies on applying band-aids to close gaps, rather than being guided by a well-articulated framework which recognises our responsibilities and duties towards other people and our community as a whole. Ultimately, individuals bear the responsibility to ensure they exercise their rights with due regard for the rights of others. For example, exercising the freedom of speech should never infringe on somebody else's rights to privacy, nor should it infringe on their right to safety. Recognising and respecting fundamental human rights are a part of a context of people living together in societies. And as part of this, there must be legal, social and international order for human rights to be realised effectively. As the Law Council of Australia notes in their submission, articulating limitations on multiple rights could be navigated in a more coherent way through a Federal Human Rights Act and a human rights framework. In the absence of a Human Rights Act, assessments for bills are being conducted in a legislative vacuum. Another challenge we face is the lack of coherent national approach to tackling racism in Australia. Again, as a member of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, I've recently had the privilege of being involved in the public hearings looking at the prevalence and experience of anti-racism in our universities. This has involved listening directly to students as they've shared their experience of the rise in anti-Semitic sentiment on campuses and their fear and abuse they have experienced. In these hearings, the committee has heard from many groups that there's urgent need to address racism and religious discrimination more broadly in Australia. The number of Australians reporting a negative attitude towards Jewish people rose by 4% in the past year, and this is truly shocking. But further to that, negative attitudes towards Muslims have risen by 7%. Leading the Scanlon Institute to report that while, and I quote, attitudes to Australians' Muslim and Jewish communities are of particular concern, relations towards and across all faiths appear to be under pressure. We've also heard from the Australian Human Rights Commission's interim report on racism at Australian universities that, firstly, Jewish students and staff cited a rise in anti-Semitism, including extremist propaganda and intimidation. At the same time, First Nations students have reported enduring structural and interpersonal racism, whilst Arab and African students reported frequently encountering severe racism, and Muslim students and staff described hostility, threats and discriminatory practices. Where are we going? This message does not, nor should it, diminish the need to specifically call out and address anti-Semitism. But it does add a sobering dynamic that makes it clear we need to tackle all forms of discrimination, racism and radicalisation in Australia. Ultimately, the messages from the experts is clear. We need a holistic national approach to these challenges that tackles them from the ground up. In this vein, the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia have called on the government to provide additional specific long-term funding for a national anti-racism framework. A federal framework like this would allow us to look beyond one-off projects and reactive legislation and provide monitoring, evaluation and strategic planning to tackle racism. And a key part of this framework needs to be the establishment of a national hate crimes database, as recommended by the Senate Standing Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs. Currently, state and federal police, and by consequence policymakers in the wider community, don't have a shared resource to track and monitor hate crimes across the country. And Australia is one of the few countries without a national database, with the USA, Canada and the UK all collecting hate-motivated crime data. Without a complete understanding of these crimes and their prevalence, our attempts to address them are in danger of being misinformed and misdirected, and fundamentally informed by poor media commentary rather than the facts. The National Cabinet's recent announcement of a national anti-Semitism database is an important first step, but I do encourage the government to consider the expansion of this program to capture all hate crimes. Finally, it's apparent that even though this bill's measures to address hate symbols and incitements of violence are important, we need systems of early intervention to prevent radicalisation and extremism before they even take seed. Criminalisation is one lever we can use to address extremist views and behaviours, but it shouldn't be either the only, or in my own personal opinion, the primary one. It's not enough to put out fires. We need to stop them from ever being lit. One proposal is the national delivery of a community-based prevention and rehabilitation programs. These programs could identify at-risk or radicalised individuals and provide them with an off-ramp from extremism. Again, the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils suggests schools are critical for educating and inoculating our young people from racism. Yet where are the resources for them? Students need to be educated on racism and its harms, as well as diversity as a positive feature of Australian life. In closing then, I've not met a single person in my community who does not believe that all Australians deserve to live in a country where they don't have to fear discrimination, hatred or violence because of their identity, and who is not shocked by the direction our country seems to have been sliding in over the course of the 3 years since this Parliament first sat. But for us to realise that ambition, we're going to need to go further than penalties for hate crimes. We need a long-term national anti-racism framework informed by robust debates and supported regardless of which side of politics you stand on. We need early interventions to prevent the spread of racism and the invoking of extremism. And we need a federal human rights framework to allow for a coherent approach to fairly balance competing rights and freedoms. My community welcomes this bill, but it needs to be the beginning of a much larger movement to create an Australia that lives up to its values of tolerance, equality and respect for all. Thank you.
I thank the member for North Sydney. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Wentworth.
Deputy Speaker, I rise today to speak in support for the Criminal Code Amendment hate crimes legislation, but also to seek this Parliament's support in passing my amendments to address some of the remaining deficiencies in the Act. In recent weeks and months, my community of Wentworth has witnessed a horrifying increase in anti-Semitic incidences. These violent and destructive attacks have targeted houses, vehicles, places of worship and even a childcare centre. Almost daily, the Jewish community is being violently targeted by criminals. These attacks target Jewish Australians, but they have frightened my whole community. My whole community is frightened. People in Wentworth have been forced to install additional security cameras, dread going away or leaving their kids home alone, and now live in a community patrolled 24/7 by police helicopters. A woman spoke to me recently saying, look, I'm meant to be going overseas for a wedding, very important wedding for her personal reasons, but she was very afraid to leave her adult daughter at home because of what was happening. It is overwhelming. This is not an Australia I recognise. Yesterday, I was very proud to put forward and get support from the entire Parliament in the House and the Senate, a motion that unanimously acknowledged the insidious rise of anti-Semitism in Australia and condemned it unequivocally. And I think that is absolutely critical. However, And this is why, to be honest, I have been working hard in the Parliament and in my community to make a real difference on anti-Semitism. Some of the things that I've been focused on are around, firstly, getting the right people there. So lobbying very hard and delivering Australia's first anti-Semitism envoy. Calling to make sure that the laws are right. So I called for, and we've successfully delivered in this Parliament, strong anti-doxing laws and outlawing of Nazi symbols and gestures. I have strongly in making sure the security services are right. That is both in terms of making sure that we deliver tens of millions of dollars for enhanced security for the Jewish community, but also making sure that the policing is coordinated. So I was calling for a national approach to policing, which the government announced before Christmas, and I meet every single week with Operation Pearl in Sydney to understand, as well as with my local police, to understand what is happening in terms of policing and make sure that the policing is right for the community that I'm facing. We've also been pushing to make sure that education is right. Now, there are two elements. One has been delivering and advocating and successfully seeing $8.5 million given to the Sydney Jewish Museum, because that is a critical facility for educating people in this space. I have brought together every single high school, invited every single high school in my electorate together to talk about anti-Semitism, to hear from the testimonies of the Jewish schools about what they're doing and what they're feeling, and how can we better make sure that the whole community and all the young people in our community are standing up against anti-Semitism. I also think a critical part has also been around community cohesion. So we have brought together, invited all the faith leaders of Wentworth together to talk about, the mutual problems and challenges of faith leaders, but also to share some of those challenges with each other and build that community. And finally, I've worked very closely with the Australian Union of Jewish Students to specifically work and put pressure on university vice-chancellors to stamp out anti-Semitism at the university. And I was doing that work before October 7 with my colleagues, the co-chairs of the Parliamentary Friends of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Josh Burns and Julian Lisa. This work is ongoing and is absolutely critical. It's a huge part of what I do in Parliament, and that is because I am really concerned about the rise in anti-Semitism. I was concerned before October 7, and I can see the impact on my community every single day. And this impact isn't just the violent occurrences. I run student forums every single term and invite students from all my schools together. Always have 2 students from all my schools together to talk about issues. In one forum very recently, 2 students talked about their experience of anti-Semitism in the streets in my community. They were walking down the streets. Someone saw that they had Jewish school uniform. A car slowed down and did a Hail Hitler sign, and then also made a swear about the Jewish people. That's what the kids in my community are dealing with, and it is absolutely shocking. I spoke to a friend of mine the day before yesterday, whose kids, similar age, young primary school age kids, and he said, it's getting really hard. We're trying to shield our kids from the anti-Semitism, but they don't understand why there are police constantly outside the schools, why the guards have increased. They don't understand why they can't go on excursions anymore, why they're not playing sport with others, why they're not being told not to wear their school uniform in certain public places. This is absolutely tragic, and it is something that I'm proud that the Parliament unified against yesterday to say that we condemn this anti-Semitism, but we need to collectively be taking strong action, and this legislation is part of the strong action that we need to take, as well as stronger sentencing, as well as stronger policing, as well as education, and as well as making sure that those who have perpetrated these crimes are actually prosecuted. But let me come to the legislation. Whether we like it or not, as lawmakers, the community is looking for us to draw a clear line in the sand. Now, Australia has, for many decades, struggled with balancing freedom of speech and the protection of safety and civil liberties. Striking such a balance is no trivial issue. But today, overseas conflicts, polarising political debates and leaders and tough economic conditions, mixed in with a seemingly apparently anonymous and impunity of the internet and social media, have created an environment in which hate and division is festering. Australia's social cohesion is not only showing cracks, but chasms. While we have strict criminal laws against things like destruction of property and vandalism, and the perpetrators behind these crimes are being pursued by law enforcement, these incidences are not random. They're not isolated. They're a result of festering hatred and animosity that is first allowed to germinate in dark corners of the internet and chat rooms, gradually manifest in speeches, gestures and placards, until it ultimately spews out onto the streets in acts of violence. It is a cumulative impact of insidious, vitriolic statements, slogans and expressions that have nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with robust debate, exchange of ideas, or the scrutiny of power. In March 2023, so let me give you some examples. In March 2023, protesters at an anti-trans rally held signs calling to destroy pedo freaks. The Royal Commission into Disability outlined instances of people's photos being posted online for the purpose of drawing vile comments and public humiliation. In 2023, an online sermon called for the final solution in relation to the Jews, echoing the words of Hitler. These acts have a very human element to the people who they're targeted towards and demonstrate a clear gap in our legal framework. As the director of ASIO, Mike Burgess, has repeatedly said, words matter. So let me move on to the changes and also their deficiencies. Within this context, it is commendable that legislation has been brought forward by the government. The current bill, as it stands, will modestly improve the existing Federal Crimes Act by lowering the fault element for existing offences from intent to recklessness, as well as by introducing a new offence for threatening force or violence. But we should be listening more carefully when the people and the groups this legislation is designed to protect continue to protest its inadequacy. This was amply highlighted by the submissions to the Senate inquiry. The Executive Council of the Australian Jury highlighted in their submission that despite gradual changes over time to the Criminal Code, there remains an environment of relative impunity with respect to the promotion, advocacy and glorification of racial and religious hatred and violence. Equality Australia and Rainbow Families, representing the LGBTIQA+ community, stated that in addition to protections against targeted threats of violence, federal regulation needs to hold hate to account and prevent its spreading. People with Disability Australia expressed disappointment that this bill does not criminalise serious forms of vilification perpetrated against targeted groups as originally intended. For these communities and others, the amendments the government has put forward are positive, but they do not go to the heart of hate and the promotion of hate and the impact that that has on our society. They make illegal only the most extreme acts, if indeed they can ever be proven beyond reasonable doubt, but do nothing against the tidal weight of hatred, abuse and harassment that people in our community are subjected to daily, incidents that make them feel insecure, unsafe and unwelcome in their own home, in their own country, in a place they were born in. Enough is enough. Our federal law is inadequate and our state and racial vilification acts represent a hodgepodge of overlapping legislation that creates different classes of offences and different standards of proof depending on where you reside in Australia. In the internet age, where state borders are irrelevant to the flow of information, this just isn't going to cut it. Legal and human rights organisations have acknowledged that we have a gaping hole in our legal framework, and I and many others believe it's time for a nationally consistent approach. That is why I'm moving an amendment to this bill that will create a new offence of serious vilification and promotion of hatred, and I urge this Parliament to support my amendment. I'm also suggesting the amendment of the term intersex status to be replaced with sex characteristics to better reflect the preference of the LGBTIQ community and the direction of not only various state laws but also international human rights recommendations. Now I acknowledge this is a really difficult area to legislate, and I'm not naive to the challenges. People are rightly concerned about the protection of freedom of speech in a robust and flourishing democracy as we have here, and so am I. But let me make some reassurances. This amendment will not remove your right to speak freely or to protest. And how do we have some certainty around this? Because the legislation, the amendment that I have based this on, is based on legislation that has been in WA for the last 20 years. In fact, the Western Australian Crimes Act has had a similar offence for the last 21 years. It's in these sections, sections 77 and 78 from Chapter 11 of the WA Criminal Code, that is actually the inspiration for my amendment. The provisions in the WA Criminal Code have not resulted in the curtailing of free speech in WA. It has not led to censorship, but it has put behind bars people who would seek to stoke hatred. In 2011, a Western Australian man, Brendan O'Connell, was found guilty of harassing a young Jewish man in 2009 under the new Section 77. But to demonstrate the law's necessary limitations, there's also precedents where these sections have rejected the instances of minor offensive slurs, because that is not what its intention. Now, I do want to talk about this point a bit further because this is really critical. The amendments I have put forward are designed to stop the promotion of hatred, the promotion of harassment, that people out there who are out there promoting it. To be convicted of this, it has to be proved beyond reasonable doubt, which is our highest evidentiary sort of proof. It has to be proved beyond reasonable doubt that you had the intention to promote hatred in the community. And now that is a really high bar, and I believe genuinely, appropriately so. But this, so when people ask me about the concerns on free speech, which I acknowledge, I say, look, do we want people who are intending to promote hatred, that is their goal? Is that something that we should be protecting, without any guardrails? Or should we also be considering, what happens to vulnerable communities when people who are promoting and, promoting and really intending to increase hatred against a group, when there is really little recourse that these individuals can have, and certainly not under the criminal code. And I think that is a real challenge and a real question. Australia has always had, some appropriate restrictions on free speech, defamation law being one of them. You can't defame somebody, and it should be there. There are guardrails, there are all sorts of things, but there are guardrails, but there are appropriate guardrails around this. And I think we need to be really clear on this. That I value in our incredibly diverse community, a country that is of people from all parts of the world, where 50% of our country was either born overseas or had a parent born overseas. Like my family was half born here, half born overseas. When it comes to my parents, we have every religion. We have so many different languages spoken at home. We are welcoming of people of different sexualities, of genders. This is the country that we're trying to protect. And I really question, should people trying to promote hatred around different parts of our groups, in different groups in our community, should they go unfettered? And I think that there should be guardrails around this, and that is why I'm seeking support from the Parliament on this. So finally, in our country, we will often disagree vehemently. We will disagree over conflicts overseas. We're a multicultural nation, and we will always have people on different sides of any conflict. But I do see that my community is unified in the sense that they do not stand for hate and intimidation of others based on the religion, sexuality, ethnic background, or ability status. They cannot be tolerated in society.
Time has expired. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. All democratic governments have to balance the freedom to express cultural and religious opinions with the competing need to ensure their citizens' freedom from discrimination. I'm concerned that, given the time pressures on this Parliament, the Albanese government is rushing consideration of a really difficult and complex piece of legislation, and in doing so, that this legislation to outlaw hate crimes in this country is doomed to failure. Deputy Speaker, between 2017 and 2021, under the previous government, we saw a series of inquiries and proposals to introduce protections against religious discrimination. That process ended with the unsuccessful Religious Discrimination Bill of 2022. At the last election, this government promised to introduce legal protections for religious beliefs, but also to legislate to protect teachers and students from discrimination. Despite that promise, the Prime Minister has indicated during this term that the government would not proceed with that religious discrimination reform without bipartisan support, and it has not done so. I felt that that was appropriate. I think that bipartisan support is really important for these important pieces of public policy. Which brings us to this legislation, aimed as it is at combating the increasing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia which are evident in Australian society since October the 7th, 2023. The last 16 months have been a time of untold tragedy in the Middle East. The actions of Hamas on October the 7th, 2023, and the subsequent response by the Israeli government have resulted in enormous human loss and suffering in Israel, in Gaza and in the other occupied territories. Australia's Jewish community felt the loss, the shock and the horror of October the 7th, immediately and profoundly. For so many, these events have affected their family members, their friends, their loved ones, in Australia but also in Israel. In recent months, the increasing wave of anti-Semitism in this country has compounded their trauma and their grief. Australian Jews have had to deal with racially based hatred of a degree and an extent previously unknown to them, although many have told me that anti-Semitism is, sadly, not new to them. The trauma of these last 16 months has exacerbated their received memory, the buried but the ever-present intergenerational impact of the Holocaust on diaspora Jewish communities, while it has also created a new trauma in which they have seen an upending of their very reasonable assumption that the past is the past. That new knowledge, that understanding that anti-Semitism is a real and present, confronting and constant issue in Australia today, has traumatised the Australian Jewish community. It has shocked those of us who are not Jewish, but who stand with those who are, and who reject and abhor this most ancient of hatreds. In many respects, it feels as though our society's capacity for respectful dialogue and empathy has been lost. Our understanding and tolerance, our support for other families in our communities, our gratitude for the many cultures and histories which contribute to our rich social fabric, they seem strained and difficult. It seems that no longer we have common ground where we have had it before. Our accepting communities seem to have hardened. They've become less generous and less inclusive. Sadly, rather than acting in a bipartisan and respectful way around these difficult times, many have chosen to politicise and weaponise the horrific events of October 7th, the ongoing plight of the hostages and of their families, the tragic impact of the Israeli government's response upon innocent Palestinian civilians, and the ongoing grief and trauma of those who watch from afar. Politicisation of this tragedy has made no one safer. Rather, it has exacerbated the anxiety and the fear felt by so many. I therefore supported yesterday's motion in Parliament to deplore the appalling and unacceptable rise in anti-Semitism in Australia, including attacks on synagogues, schools, homes and childcare centres. I unequivocally condemn and reject anti-Semitism and racism in all of their forms, as I condemn similar hate directed to any group in our community. Jewish Australians, no Australians, should have to live with discrimination and vilification based on their religion. I call on all of my colleagues in this place to support this rejection of hatred and of ignorance, and to express solidarity with our Jewish Australian brothers and sisters. Australia's Muslim community has also been affected by an increase in religious and culturally motivated hate speech. I think of the constituent who came to my office and told me that she cannot and will not speak of such things publicly because on the only occasion that she did, she was labelled a terrorist by her friends. I think of the mum who brought her 2 small children to my electorate office not long after October the 7th. They told me that they were really worried for their cousins in Gaza. Their small children were sad because they felt that this country didn't care about them or about their loss. Australia's anti-Islamophobia envoy, Aftab Malik, has already reported that Islam is associated in the media and in the majority public mind with radicalism, extremism and terrorism. He has reported that Islamophobia is normalised in Australia, but that it is underreported, and that violence, hatred and discrimination against Muslims are widespread daily realities in this country. So I call on my colleagues in this place also to reject that hatred and that ignorance, and to express our solidarity with our Muslim Australian brothers and sisters. Deputy Speaker, the events of the last 16 months firstly led to the Prohibited Hate Symbols Bill, which I supported when we legislated it in 2023. The new and additional measures included in the bill, now before the House, are a further response to the increasing prevalence of hate speech and hateful conduct in our society. The bill extends protections to groups defined by race, religion, nationality, national or ethnic origin or political opinion, to add sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, which is an outmoded terminology, and I agree with the member from Wentworth that it should be altered to sexual characteristics, and disability. The bill, as presented to this Parliament, has actually stepped back from the government's initial plan, which was to criminalise religious hate speech. Instead, only conduct will be criminalised where it involves threats of force and violence, or violence. We do have to maintain a balance between the freedom of expression and from protecting the Australian community from discrimination and hate. We have to have carefully framed laws which proscribe speech inciting radicalisation and violence. While protection of freedom of expression is crucial in certain circumstances, that right has to be subjected to limitation, and that includes advocacy of hatred, which constitutes incitement to discrimination. Many Kooyong constituents have described to me in recent months their feeling that the federal laws that we have passed in this place are not being enforced in Melbourne, that they no longer feel safe in our city on weekends. I have responded by asking the federal and state attorneys general to clarify their attitudes to these and to other concerns, including the ongoing protests in the state of Melbourne, in the city of Melbourne every weekend. It's frustrating that just this week in Victorian Parliament, the Liberal opposition has voted against legislation which is similar to that now before this House. And the fact that we have a hodgepodge and melange of ineffective state and federal legislations around these matters is frustrating for people who are most concerned by them. The public deserves to understand and to feel protected by our laws. They need to know that they will be enforced. Otherwise, our actions here and those of our state governments are pointless. But our responsibility to the public is also to ensure that any limitations that we put on their ability to gather peacefully and to express their ideas and opinions are necessary, precise and proportionate. It's unclear to what extent this legislation currently in front of the House will be impactful. I note that there have been no prosecutions or convictions in the 35 years since New South Wales criminalised vilification involving threat of physical harm or property damage. These new Commonwealth offences have complex definitions. It will be challenging to prove them beyond a reasonable doubt. Deputy Speaker, we also have a responsibility to identify and understand the drivers that are attracting people to the far right and acting in the ways that we are attempting to address with the legislation currently before the House. The horrific firebombing of the Adass Israel synagogue in Ripponlea in Melbourne was a terrorist attack. So too were the 2 attacks on synagogues in Sydney and the horrifying recent attack on a childcare centre in Sydney, while the finding of a caravan packed with explosives shocked the whole country. Passing legislation of the sort currently before the House will not stop those sorts of activities. We have to do more to understand who is committing these crimes, what motivates them, and how we can cut anti-Semitism and other forms of racism off at the roots. Passage of these laws in the House today will not stop those forms of mindless violence. We have to do better as a nation. We have to work to find what binds us and not to divide us. We have to say publicly and repeatedly, in the face of hate speech, no, never again.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Riverina.
I am quite sad to be rising in the Federation Chamber to have to speak on a bill such as this. The Criminal Code Amendment Hate Crimes Bill 2024 is a necessary, but it should be a very unnecessary bill to come before this Parliament. In 2024, we shouldn't have to pass a bill such as this. We shouldn't have to be discussing this in a Parliament when there are so many other issues at hand which are placing such pressure on Australians. We should be discussing matters of the economy, matters of the environment, matters of defence. But instead, we are here spending an inordinate amount of time discussing something that should not be necessary. I came to Parliament this morning and was stopped by a red light, and across the road this woman walked brandishing rather proudly a Palestinian flag. And that is okay, she is free to do that. We live in a democracy. But the number of Palestinian flags that are being waved, the amount of hatred that is coming out across the nation is beyond belief. And it's not just capital cities. Just before the former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg had his very good documentary last year, I spoke to him, as I do every week, but spoke to him about the fact that this isn't just something confined to Sydney and Melbourne. This is right across Australia, and indeed, I'm sad to say, even in my hometown of Wagga Wagga, the anti-Semitism is rife, and it should not be so. We have a fellow who, in his Fitzmaurice Street shop front window, displays words and images I would not repeat here. The constituents of my electorate and visitors to Wagga Wagga make a daily file into my office, into my electorate office, in the same street, in the next block, just up the road from where this shop front is, complaining every day. And the same people go to our local police station just around the corner in Tarcutta Street and complain. And yet the police say there is nothing they can do given the laws that we have. It is apparently okay to display in huge letters 4-letter words that should not be seen. Not be seen by children with impressionable minds, not be seen by adults. And yet every week he comes up with a new image, a new form of words, and if this isn't anti-Semitism, then I don't know what is. And yet our police apparently are powerless to stop this. And constituents complain to me, and I have to say I'm probably the only community leader in Wagga who's been game enough, brave enough to say something about it. And I have copped it. I have copped it from him, I have copped it on social media, and I've got this group of people who call themselves Sundays for Peace, who up until just recently, indeed up until Australia Day, were meeting every Sunday. I won't say meeting, I'll say protesting. Admittedly, they've been gatherings. Twice my office has been daubed with unnecessary posters and unnecessary images and artwork. I call it graffiti. Twice I've gone to the police. Again, the police say they're powerless. I'm a public figure. And yet if I went round and daubed this person's shop front window with slogans and material that he found offensive, I would be charged. And the police have told me that. The police have also told me it would be best if you don't go to your electorate office at the same time on a Sunday because of these people. And I have spoken to the Prime Minister, and he has told me that he hasn't been able to go to his Newtown electorate office because of the same sort of situation, the same sort of protesters. Now, they used to call themselves Fridays for Future. They were protesting when we were in government, when I was the Deputy Prime Minister, about the climate. But you know what? When Labor took over, apparently the climate changed. It altered for the better. Everything was good again. And then, of course, we had October 7, 2023, that day of infamy. And not long after that, the protesters arrived. And initially I went out to greet them, as I always would. to talk to them rationally, sensibly about what they were protesting about. I always do that. And I was shouted down. I was told that I was cheering on, and I stopped this fellow short before he could say the murder of children. But that was what they'd suggested a little prior to that. And then when I arced up and said that is not the case, I have said publicly that a Palestinian baby born is every bit as innocent as an Israeli baby, but they weren't satisfied with that. And then when I obviously was challenging them on that precept, they said, well, the Prime Minister, he is cheering on this murder. I said, no, the Prime Minister has not said that. He has not uttered those words, and you should not say that. And then they found it necessary to go to an animal remembrance military commemoration in the Victoria Memorial Gardens of all things. And they decided to take their protest there, knowing that I was there and knowing that there would be media there, waving their Palestinian flags in front of the Light Horse reenactment troop, getting in the way, getting up in people's faces with their mobile phones, taking photos. And someone asked me to call the police, and I did. I wasn't the first one to call the police, but I did call the police. And the police came. And then, of course, as I was walking back through the park with my wife and family, I was yelled at, baby killer, baby killer, baby killer. Now, I won't cop that, but I had to. And all I said was I turned and I said, I have not ever said that. I have only ever said in the Parliament that an Israeli and a Palestinian baby are both born innocent and that they deserve all the peace and freedom that children are entitled to. And that wasn't good enough. They still screamed at me. A couple of days later, letter to the editor of the Wagga Daily Advertiser that I had screamed at them. And they've continued this. Next time I happened to be near my office, electorate office, on a Sunday, again, baby killer, baby killer. This is not Wagga Wagga. And yet, because I've objected, I somehow am the subject of their remarks. But I can cop that. I'm big enough and shoulders are broad enough, and it's water off a duck's back. But it should not be happening in Wagga Wagga. They've had marches down the main street where they've talked about the killing of babies, and they're only one-sided. And it is anti-Semitism. I don't care what anybody says. They'll probably read this speech on Hansard and I'll be the subject of their derision again. Well, go your hardest, seriously. But the difficulty is that they do make such a protest, and you know, when you've got a fellow in the local paper who writes a weekly column, sometimes it's more than weekly, who only ever presents one side of the argument, and that's the pro-Palestinian argument. These people call them, by the name of Ray Goodless, and their columns are so biased. And that's all the Wagga Wagga people are subjected to. You don't hear the other side unless it comes from me. And that is a problem, because if you keep chipping away, people start to think, well, maybe they're right. And they're not right. They are wrong. They are absolutely wrong, because it is anti-Semitism. And these shopfront displays, these flagrant displays of anti-Semitism ought to stop. The police ought to have powers to be able to do so. And whilst I am a big believer in free speech, this is out of control. I made comments about the new principal of the new Medina College at Young in the Southwest Slopes in the Riverina electorate, Sheikh Abdul Ghani Al-Baf, who has made some highly inappropriate remarks on social media, and he talked about when I first objected to his posts and a letter I had written to a constituent from Young. He wrote that he wrote in the posts and in the comments on his social media, described me as human look like animals, and invoked Allah, the best disposer. Now, this is not Australia. Don't bring your problems to our country. We can't solve the Middle East crisis from Fitzmaurice Street, Wagga Wagga, the streets of the streets of Sydney, or indeed the steps of the Opera House. We cannot. And this country has a proud multicultural history. The Riverina is, I believe, the cradle of multiculturalism. Heaven knows we brought so many people from so many disparate and desperate nations to turn a desert into a fertile Garden of Eden, which we now call the Murrumbidgee Irrigation Area. And they worked together. People from all nations in Europe who had not that long before that been fighting with weapons. These days, some people, and they convince Australians too, to fight with words. Sadly, that is why we need legislation such as this, so that the words can be combated, so that we can right the wrongs. And we shouldn't need to have to pass legislation like this. But the words being uttered on October 9 on the steps of the Opera House, I have to say I felt sorry for the police. And I know that they listened to the tapes and they came out with a view that they weren't suggesting what was said against the Jews. But we all know they were. We all know that they hate the Jews. And why people hate Jewish people, I can't comprehend it. I just cannot comprehend it. I can't comprehend it in a society such as Australia, where we welcome people from all nationalities, all faiths, all orientations, and we do and we should and we will go on doing that. But the comments by the Sheikh, who is now the principal of the New Medina College at Young, he needs to tone his language down, and I've said so, and he's been castigated for it. The Sundays for Peace, who are now meeting only once a month, shouldn't be meeting at all. Heaven help us if they actually spent their time working for St Vincent de Paul or Anglicare or some other organisation. Their hours would be much better spent. The Wagga Wagga community would be far better off than wasting their time waiting for perhaps a visit by me to my electorate office on a Sunday so they can scream abuse at me. And I won't cop people screaming abuse at my wife, Catherine. I will not do that. And you know, I come to this place willingly, and it's a great honour and a great privilege. But my family should not be subjected to the sort of abuse that they rain down upon us. And she's big enough and tough enough to withstand that as well. But certainly it is so unnecessary. And my staff shouldn't have to clean up the office when they decide to put their posters and post them up with thick glue on the back. That shouldn't have to happen. And our police should have powers to tap them on the shoulder. And this fellow denied doing it, this Michael Exarian, and yet when the police said, well, is this you on the CCTV? He had to admit it was him. He had to admit it was him. And this is the sort of people they are. But it has to stop, because Wagga Wagga is a wonderful community. I say it's the best place in all of Australia in which to live. Of course I would, I'm biased. I love the place. I was born there. I've lived there in and around Wagga Wagga all my life. It should not be a place where anti-Semitic comments and a group which meets now only once a month on a Sunday, which is quite frankly just another branch of the Greens. And the Greens have a lot to answer for in this whole debate. The Greens have a lot to answer for the divisive activities that have occurred right across our nation. And I feel sorry for the Prime Minister that he can't go to his electorate office because of these actions. I do believe that the Prime Minister should have been stronger on this issue, stronger earlier, but he wasn't. But he shouldn't be subjected to the sort of rubbish that he has, and nor should it happen in Wagga Wagga. But as I say, it's not just the capital cities, it is right across the nation. It has to stop. The Jews have actually done a lot for our nation. They are Australians, and we, as all Australians, should support and protect them.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for New England.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I concur with the remarks of the member for Riverina, especially other people being taken in, like Catherine, into the realm of a political life when they never bought the ticket, and it's an absolute disgrace. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I was at the University of New England, my old alumni, there was a quote by Caius Cornelius Tacitus extemporanea modus, which is from wisdom comes moderation. And moderation, of course, is an incredibly important thing. Why would Tacitus be so enthralled on moderation? Because moderation is what keeps people in a harmonious relationship with one another, where people don't get hurt, where we have tolerance, where we rely on difference, but we don't take it to a point that we are prepared to do harm to another person. Tolerance from moderation. Madam Deputy Speaker, I come from a family who all served in the Defence Forces, both grandparents, both my grandfathers, my father. Tragically, my grandmother was English. Now, we're not quite sure because they came from the Midlands and it was a pretty sort of depressed process. I think 7 brothers were killed. They were all killed, all the boys, all gone. So, enthralled on me from a young age was moderation and the evils of those who live in the shadows of the extremes on either side of the political fence of the left and the right, and the absolute horrendous mechanism of hate that they enthrall the masses with for the destruction of people. Now, we saw it in its most profound and evil form, of course, in the events that followed 1938 and probably started in the 1933 Social Service Act of Germany, where they decided in the path that they were going to start the exclusion of a certain race of people, Jewish people. And what they work on the back of is a political, social, economic, ethical malaise that was so evident in the Great Depression. And with the promulgation of an ethos that worked on the back of that, they had the capacity to therefore target a certain group of people and place on their head the profound problems that were there in Europe, especially in the hyperinflation and the economic destruction that followed the First World War in Germany. But of course, it was the art of evil. It wasn't a group of people that brought that about, and probably go back to the economic circumstances of the armistice that brought that about. But what was the purpose of this evil that came forward? And how did it get to the point where we could believe and people stood by and watched people, and they knew about it, be put into the wholesale factory-like incineration, destruction, starvation, belittlement, everything that went through the Holocaust? Now, I'm not Jewish, but I certainly did take from stories that were conveyed to me by my father about my grandfather and how there was just this absolute unbelievable disdain, like, why would you do this? And the way they held the people who did that in absolute and utter contempt. Now, the thing about Australia, and might I say New Zealand, is we have an incredible egalitarian ethos that you don't understand till you go somewhere else. All the time in Australia, if you're too much on the edge, people tell you to tone it down. Take it down a cog, take a pill, because we don't like extremism. Inherently in us, we see the evil that perpetrates that, the evil seed that grows in that garden that lives on the extreme of the left and the right. And it's not just that we see it in anti-Semitism. That is the most profound thing, and I'll go to that because that's what we're seeing now. But you saw it in Pol Pot, in the extreme of the left. You saw it in Mao's China, the wholesale destruction of people through the Cultural Revolution, just starving them to death, which I did have family members, sides of the family of Chinese, that certainly did live that. Why? Because they'd been to university. Apparently that was evil, so they'll send out to the countryside to die. So much for them that the trees died because they ate the bark off them. So that's where you can get. That's what happens when you let this evil animal, this evil snake, have its head. So what we absolutely encumbered, we're absolutely is our philosophical premise of being an Australian, and our duty is when we see this start to rise up. You don't wait. You don't wait till it comes to its horrific time in the throne. You deal with it immediately. Immediately. And that's what's gone wrong here. This thing has started. It's like a fire. When a fire gets out outside the tip of filth and into the grass, you don't wait till it's halfway up the hill before you try to put it out. You put it out immediately. We haven't put this out. And it's grown in the sort of, it's followed exactly the same malaise as what they've followed, whether it's in the absolute evil of Germany in the period 1933 through to 45. It starts innocuously, like, oh, they're just a bunch of radicals, don't worry about them, they're just in the corner, they'll never go anywhere, no one takes them seriously. Well, they didn't in Germany either. They didn't take them seriously until they started mustering up people from the whole of Europe and murdering them. And even then, once they got to that point, let's be honest, most people just stood by and watched. Most people just stood by and watched. So we have, and this the premise of this, we have a duty to jump on this. Not to jump on it just from the Conservative side or from the Labor side, but from both sides. From people of moderation, we are duty bound to deal with this, and to deal with this immediately. And if we have respect for those who have fought for our nation, remember there are tens of thousands of Australians who died against the extreme regimes, which was fascism, the filth of fascism, and I call it that, the filth of fascism, and its like-minded person in Imperial Japan. Same thing, just wholesalely murdered people, didn't care. See, what happens if you let this away is a certain group of people determine that another group of people are merely animals, and they act like animals in how they deal with people. So this is why this issue, it's not just incumbent on this Parliament, but on all Australians. In that ethos of egalitarianism, or the ethos of moderation, is when you hear someone like the member of Riverina was talking about, you're actually duty bound to go up to them and say, mate, tone it down. I don't find that acceptable, what you've said. You are not respecting the egalitarian nature of Australia. You know, we know what you're doing. You're inciting hate. You're inciting a movement. You're basically working on the back of that. And I would say that in so much of this. They work on the back of issues pertinent to the Middle East, which we're seeing in Israel, in Gaza, and they're working on the back of that. And it's not for the betterment of the people of Gaza. They're not turning up there to say we're going to build hospitals or try and deal with the issues of there. You know, we're going to join a United Nations peacekeeping force. They're using it in Australia for the incitement of a movement of the extreme. And in the incitement of the movement of the extreme, we've once more in our nation, I would say I've never seen it in my memory, but for the first time, out of the tip of filth, the fire is in the grass. And now we've all got a job to put this fire out. And this bill is a part of that, is a part of what we've done here. Obviously, I don't know how much is gained or added to by going through the history of the process, but it is a fact that on October the 7th, Israel was invaded. That's as simple as that. And if Australia was invaded in the same form as Israel was invaded, you would expect a response from this Parliament and our Defence Force that was absolutely profound, and to deal with it in such a form as to remove the threat. That's what would be the expectation if from some island that we've never heard of, that sort of manifests itself overnight and it decided to attack Australia and do what happened on October the 7th in Israel, then the response of the Australian Army, as on the direction, whether it was Labor, Liberal, National, whatever you like, would be you must deal with that immediately and in the most profound way. Okay, but we all want peace there. There's There is no solace or solution in the loss of life for innocent people. Actually, that's a problem. Some people do believe that's okay. In fascism, they did believe to murder innocent people was A-OK. In Pol Pot, they did believe it. In Stalinist Russia, they did believe it. In Maoist China, they did believe it. In the Tutus and the Houthis in Rwanda, they did believe in it. They did believe it's all right to murder innocent people, throw them down toilets, fill up football stadiums with them and just murder them outright. They did believe that. No doubt it's happening right now. But it's incumbent upon Australia, when we see this, when we see it on racial grounds, on religious grounds, on ethical grounds, when people pop up and start espousing their views, and it's always the same, they believe they are 100% right and everybody else is 100% wrong. And on that premise, they believe they have the right to create harm. And it doesn't stop there. They ultimately believe they have the right to kill other humans because they believe the other humans are not human. They are less than human. They are subhuman. In my family, going back in conclusion, it was in symbols of hate, we were not allowed to even draw a swastika. It was not allowed. To draw a warplane, do not put a swastika on it. My father was absolutely, and he was from the right, he was a conservative, but he had a pathological dislike of fascism. It was a subject, an issue that would be held in absolute disdain. There was nothing to be mentioned but that it was evil. There was nothing to be mentioned that any semblance of it, any sense of it, any sight of it was to be crushed. When my father's other friends came around, ex-servicemen, served in New Guinea, served all around, served in the Middle East, they were from every side. My dad was, they joked because he actually started probably in the left. He started as a boilermaker, fitter and turner, actually met Chifley. He was from the right when it was finished, but his mates who'd fought in Papua New Guinea, one of them was a pacifist, Jim Flower. He demanded never to wear a firearm, but he was one of the bravest people there. He'd go out in the scrub, find people screaming, get them back to a hospital, and he did that. And when he was around his unit, he was seen as one of the bravest men who'd ever lived. He was from the left. He was definitely from the left. Drove my mother crazy because she was from the right. But all these people had one thing in common, moderation. Moderation. We have a beer together. We don't get too worked up about politics. Don't bang on too much about your religion. That's your business. Keep your business to yourself because this is how we get along in this nation. And these symbols of hate say that ethos of Australia, that egalitarian ethos, is to be put aside for an alternate view. Now, it shouldn't be part of any part of the world, but most definitely it should never be part of Australia. It is just not who we are. And like the filth that comes out of the tip, the fire that comes out of the tip and lands in the grass, what we have to do is immediately, from the Labor side, from the Liberal side, from the National side, from the crossbench side, is immediately find that fire, seek out and close with that fire and put it out, and don't let them divide us up. So you got no friends on the Labor side, you got no friends on the crossbench side, you got no friends anywhere. This filth is going out, this filth is going back into the tip, and we're going to find a backhoe and we're going to cover you up and you can just basically lie dormant like a dinosaur.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Indi.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. I rise to speak on this bill today with deep sadness, with deep concern about the state of our nation and with a deep sense of purpose. Because our country is at a decisive point, and it's the role of this Parliament to ensure we set this nation on the right course, that we send a strong message and call out appalling behaviour and actions for what they are, criminal acts. The Criminal Code Amendment, Hate Crimes Bill, aims to strengthen Australia's criminal laws to provide better protection against hate crimes. It does so in three main ways. First, the bill strengthens existing offences for urging the use of force or violence. It does so by widening their application so that they apply when someone urges force or violence against members of a group distinguished by sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status and disability. The offence currently protects groups distinguished by race, religion, nationality, national or ethnic origin or political opinion. The bill also strengthens the offence for urging the use of force or violence by removing the defence of good faith and changing the fault element the prosecution must prove from intent to recklessness. These changes will make it easier to successfully prosecute for this offence. Second, the bill creates a new criminal offence for threatening force or violence against targeted groups and members of targeted groups that I listed earlier. This will help fill a gap in the current laws to address conduct which involves a direct threat from one person to another rather than to a group or a member of a group. And thirdly, the bill strengthens the public display of prohibited hate symbols, offences, laws that were passed by this place last year, and the bill does this by expanding the list of groups which these offences protect to include groups distinguished by sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status. We debate this bill at a time of grave risk and vulnerability for Australia's Jewish community. The level of anti-Semitism we have experienced in this country over recent months is unlike anything I've witnessed in my lifetime. And I can't imagine the fear Jewish Australians are living with. Just last week, we marked the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and we know anti-Semitism is one of the oldest forms of hatred. It is a fear and a wound that is generations deep. In Australia, we are free to practice our faith, but it's clear there are people out there who seek to intimidate, to terrorise, to hate, and to do this to people because of their Jewish faith. Graffiti on cars, homes, schools, childcare centres, workplaces and places of worship. The arson attack on the Adas Israel Synagogue in Melbourne. A caravan packed with explosives in Sydney with the address of a Sydney synagogue on a piece of paper inside. And these incidents are truly terrifying. And of course, that is their purpose, to incite terror, hatred and fear. And we cannot allow these incidents to go by unremarked, unchecked. These incidents must not be normalised. They must never be excused. The perpetrators of these attacks must be held to the full force of the law. There must be consequences for these vile actions which have no place in our society. They have no place in Australia. This bill is just part of the ways in which government can and should respond to the hateful acts of violence and threats against the Australian Jewish community. But more must be done as well. It's important to note that this bill is not exclusively about anti-Semitism, but covers hate crimes against members of a community with protected attributes, including sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status and disability. And this is vital because there are many marginalised groups in our community who are also feeling vulnerable, that there are people out there who wish them ill will, who wish to do them harm because of their faith, their sexuality, their gender, their identity, their disability. And these fears are not unfounded. Anti-Muslim graffiti and incidents are also increasing in our community, and these incidents must be acknowledged, they must be counted, they must be stamped out. I acknowledge the fear and unease in the LGBTIQ community, and we must be constantly alive to the discrimination and hatred members of this community experience as well. Acknowledging the hatred and intimidation experienced by other members of the community does not seek to minimise the impact of the escalation in anti-Semitism on the Jewish community in Australia. We must call out all types of hatred, all efforts to threaten and intimidate people based on their faith, their sexuality, their gender, their disability, because this is how we become a truly cohesive society. And I agree with the words of the member for New England and the member for Riverina just now, that it is not just the Parliament who is responsible here, as indeed we most certainly are, but it is every single Australian who must look into their own heart and into their own actions and never walk past or remain silent when they see this hatred in action. I acknowledge the amendments put forward in good faith to this bill. The member for Wentworth has worked closely with Jewish leaders and equality advocates to draft amendments that expand the bill to cover serious vilification offences. The member for Wentworth's electorate has experienced horrific attacks over the last few months in particular, and we must listen to them to find the solutions. The member for Wentworth's amendments to the bill would address gaps in legislation where the promotion of violence and hatred is not considered a crime because it does not meet the requirements of explicitly urging or threatening violence. The offence will focus on promotion of hatred and violence and draws upon existing laws in Western Australia that have been tested in the courts to ensure it achieves the right balance with free speech principles. I support these amendments and I urge the whole Parliament to also support them. This is not about restricting freedom of speech. It's about proper consequences for threats and promoting violence against specific groups. And I also note the Coalition's amendments to explicitly outlaw threats and attacks against places of worship. And again, I condemn the abhorrent attacks and threats against synagogues that have recently occurred. And it's for this reason I support the Coalition's amendments. This bill is a crucial element of our nation's response to the rising anti-Semitism the Jewish community faces. It's an addition to our criminal code that frankly is overdue. But it's not the start and end of how we as a parliament, as legislators from across the political spectrum, should respond to the problems that we face. In their submission, the Law Council of Australia warned, and I quote, "There are significant limitations on the role of criminal law as an instrument of social policy." And we should dwell on this point. How will the government, the parliament, we as legislators and leaders of this country influence our social fabric, our social cohesion? We must continue to act, to combat hate, to build trust and safety and bonds across all the different communities that make up our great country, Australia. Because we will not prosecute our way to social cohesion, we won't. Social cohesion is something that is created, something that's tended and protected. Tim Costello recently wrote for the Australian Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and I quote, "Social cohesion is both a gift and a challenge. Building it requires risk and maintaining it requires crossing lines." He called out, again I quote, "conflict entrepreneurs who have politicised the conflict in Gaza and then decried the breakdown in social cohesion." The terror attack on Israel on October the 7th, 2023 was abhorrent. The destruction and loss of life in Gaza in the time since then has been devastating. The current ceasefire is fragile. There are those in Australia who have sought to capitalise on these events to drive division, to widen the cracks into a fissure that cannot be crossed. And they have done through threats, through violence, through intimidation. And we must not stand for it. We must stand for peace.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak on the Criminal Code Hate Crimes Bill 2024. This is an issue, the challenge of anti-Semitism and how we respond to it as a nation, which is of great concern to many, many Australians and certainly is an issue of very considerable concern in the electorate of Bradfield, which has the second largest Jewish community of any federal electorate in New South Wales. It has 4 synagogues. It has a Jewish school, Masada College. Just last Friday, I was at a service at one of those 4 synagogues, North Shore Synagogue in Linfield, at the invitation of Rabbi Lewin. I was joined by the Mayor of Ku-ring-gai, Christine Kay, by the State Member for Davidson, Matt Cross, by the Liberal candidate for Bradfield, Giselle Kapterian. And we were there, along with other local dignitaries and leaders to express our concern for our local Jewish community and for the Jewish community of Australia. Our local Jewish community, I know, along with the Jewish community all across Australia, is rightly enormously concerned about the shocking upsurge in anti-Semitism we have seen throughout Australia since the October 7, 2023 Hamas terrorist attack in Israel. Indeed, I've attended numerous events in my electorate over the last year and a half in response to the enormous and entirely justifiable and understandable concerns of my Jewish constituents, and I might say the broader body of my constituents in Bradfield, because in Bradfield, as around Australia, alarm and concern about the outbreak of anti-Semitism in Australia is certainly felt by Jewish Australians, but it is felt by Australians of goodwill of all faiths and none, because it is a threat to social cohesion, it is a threat to social order, it is a threat to civilisation and to the values which underpin our modern Australian nation. In October of 2023, shortly after the appalling October 7 terrorist attack, I attended a moving service at Kehillat Masada Synagogue in St Ives. Several North Shore synagogues came together in that service. It was physically held at Masada, as I mentioned, and a significant number of local dignitaries and leaders joined that event, and it was an opportunity for the Bradfield Jewish community, the North Shore Jewish community, to come together in mutual support and to express their support for the victims of the appalling terrorist attack, the loved ones, the families, and indeed for all who were rightly concerned about that appalling event. In June last year, I spoke at a community forum at North Shore Synagogue about anti-Semitism. In August 2024, there was another event at the North Shore Synagogue with a focus on Jewish teenagers and young people. In November of 2024, I spoke at Chabad House, one of our other synagogues in St Ives, about anti-Semitism. Spoke to a group of about 120 people, answered questions for quite a considerable period of time, evidence of the enormous degree of concern amongst our Jewish community in Bradfield, as there is enormous concern amongst Jews and their friends and supporters all across Australia. I visited the home of Jewish constituents in St Ives, where I heard from several families, parents and teenage and young adult children, about the anti-Semitism and bullying that those Jewish young people have been experiencing. I rise therefore to speak on this bill with very considerable interest in the issues it seeks to address and a clear recognition of its importance to social cohesion in our nation, but its particular importance to the community that I represent in Bradfield. Sadly, we have seen from the present government a lamentable failure to engage in a determined and effective way with the rise of anti-Semitism. The fact is, Mr Deputy Speaker, Australia is one of the world's great multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious nations. That is something in which we should all take enormous pride. And our success in this regard is built on core Australian values of mutual tolerance, of respect, of understanding. The anti-Semitism that we have seen and its violent manifestations, the shocking incidents we have seen across Australia, are entirely at odds with the values of mutual tolerance, respect and understanding which underpin Australia's success as a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural, multi-religious nation. And they are to be condemned, these outbreaks of anti-Semitism, for a whole host of reasons, But one of the reasons they are to be condemned is because they are wholly at odds with the values which underpin our modern Australian nation. The sad fact is that the appalling terrorist attack in Israel on the 7th of October 2023 has energised and unleashed Hamas sympathisers in Australia. And that is something absolutely to be regretted, to be condemned, and to be accurately recognised and described as entirely at odds with Australian values. It is disappointing that we have not seen a stronger, clearer, more courageous response from the Prime Minister and from the Albanese Labor government. It is mystifying that the Prime Minister and other senior Labor figures find it impossible, evidently, to speak about anti-Semitism without in the very same sentence using the word Islamophobia. Mr Deputy Speaker, let's be clear. Hatred directed at Jews must be condemned. Hatred directed at Muslims must be condemned. But they do not need to be endlessly linked in a rhetorical formula used by self-declared progressives as some kind of designated form of moral equivalence. We need to recognise that there is a particular and serious problem with anti-Semitism, and we need to have a clear and strong policy response. That being said, Mr Deputy Speaker, the changes made by the laws that are proposed before the House today are changes that the Coalition welcomes and supports. We regret that it's taken so long to get to this point, given that the bill was introduced in the last sitting week in September 2024. We've made efforts to encourage the government to speed it up. It's good that we have this bill before us. There should be no doubt in the minds of anybody engaging in the kind of violent anti-Semitic conduct that we have seen, sadly, over the last year and a half, that they face serious jail time. The measures in this bill are strong, but they are necessary. The scourge of anti-Semitism is something we must be resolute in opposing. It is fundamentally at odds with the values which underpin the modern Australian nation, one of the world's great multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious nations, and that is why strong action is necessary.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Cowper.
Thanks very much, Deputy Speaker. I'm saddened to rise to speak on the Criminal Code Amendment Hate Crimes Bill. I never thought I would come to this place and talk about anti-Semitism and its rise that we've seen over the past 18 months. Deputy Speaker, in 1947, a ship loaded with Hungarian migrants came to Australia. Most of them were Jews, not all of them, but they were all fleeing the persecution that they'd seen during Second World War from the fascist regime, the Nazis. Two of those on board were Joseph Kovac and Steve Katarinka. They'd never met each other. Joseph Kovac was lucky. His parents were educated. They were teachers. He was educated. He learnt to speak English at a young age. His whole family were wiped out by the Nazis. Similarly, Stephen Katarinka, he was from a poor family. His whole family was wiped out by the Nazis. And that would have been the same story for most of those people on that boat. They came to Australia and went to Cowra, to the migrant camp out there. And then when they were able to, they moved to Sydney. but they stayed friends. They set up a tea house in Paddington. And anybody who knows Paddington, it is right in the centre of an area which has a large Jewish settlement today. They then went on to open a small goods shop, and they both prospered in Australia. Joe went on to work 30-odd years with Qantas, and Stephen actually had a very large chicken supply business down on the south coast. But one thing in common that they had, apart from the persecution and the loss of their families, was the love of Australia, the freedom they loved in Australia, and the democracy they had in Australia. And the fact they could walk through the streets of Paddington without being persecuted for being a minority group. What we have seen over the past 12 months, both Joe and Steve would be rolling in their graves. I fear that this bill is too little too late. And the cynic in me says it's come about because we have an election coming up. I hope to God that is not true. What we've seen over the past 12 months is disgusting. It is disgusting to see in Australia. After the October 7 attacks, which can only be described as pure evil, seeing people standing on a world-renowned monument, the Opera House, chanting anti-Jewish slogans about, anti-Semitic slogans, should have been stopped there and then. But the response from this government has been equivocal. Despite time and time again, Deputy Speaker, Peter Dutton, David Littleproud, the Coalition, putting forward motions to suspend standing orders, to talk about this, to do something about this, being knocked down, silence from Labor, or being equivocal from Labor. But worse still, some of the independents and the Greens pouring fuel on the fire, making it even worse. And it has. It's escalated. It's escalated from the Opera House to graffiti, to fire bombings, and now a terrorist, or a thankfully thwarted terrorist attack with a caravan full of explosives. This evil has been propagated by the fact the Prime Minister of this country has been equivocal, that we haven't stood up and said, we will not put up with this. Deputy Speaker, recently in my electorate, on the 1st of June, I got a phone call that my office had been graffitied with "I on Rafa." Big red paint, splashed everywhere, in Coffs Harbour. The same red paint that was used on my office only the year before saying "koala killer." These ideologues, these people wouldn't know which river to which sea. It's just something shiny and new for them to get on. It's the same extremists who used to abuse me about the climate, which apparently was all fixed when Labor got in. But Dave Sharma came up to my electorate, Deputy Speaker, to speak to some of the Liberal Party members who are up in my electorate. And one of them asked a question about the anti-Semitic behaviour that had been occurring in Coffs Harbour. You don't have to go to Melbourne or Sydney for it to happen. Jewish members of my community are being abused. Jewish members in my community, their businesses are being boycotted. And one of them asked me, what can we do? My response was, why should you be doing anything when our leaders aren't? The standard you walk past is the standard that you accept. Our leaders, the Police Commissioner in New South Wales, the Prime Minister, the commissioners in every state and territory should be getting their troops together and saying, if you see this, if you hear anti-Semitic slogans, if you see people carrying flags from terrorist organisations, then you lock them up. Have we seen that? How can we expect our community to stand up against these lunatics, and that's what they are, lunatics, with evil intentions? How can we ask our people, whether they're in the city or whether they're in the regions, to stand up against these evil actors, as they're called, when our leaders won't? Only last week, I was waiting to do an interview on 2GB with Mark Levy about the crime that's happening in regional or rural Australia. And the Police Commissioner was being interviewed, Commissioner Karen Webb. She was being interviewed by Mark Levy, who's doing his best to call out this anti-Semitic behaviour across the country. And he asked the question, why these people weren't being locked up for chanting from the river to the sea. That chant is part of Hamas's charter from 2017, from the river to the sea, and it talks about the ethnic cleansing of Jews, getting rid of Jews. That's from their charter. That's not me saying that. This is a listed terrorist organisation. Mark Levy said to the Commissioner, why can't you lock them up for saying this? Her response was, in my view, it doesn't amount to breaching Section 93Z or Z of the Crimes Act in New South Wales. 93Z says an offence of publicly threatening or inciting violence on the grounds of race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity or intersex or HIV/AIDS status. A person who, by a public act, intentionally or recklessly threatens or incites violence towards another person or a group of persons for any of the following reasons is guilty of an offence: A, the race of that person or one or more of the group; B, that the other person has, or one or more of the members of the group have, a specific religious belief or affiliation. From the river to the sea talks about ethnic cleansing of Jews. How is that not a breach of 93Z? The Commissioner's response, in my view, I don't see it as a breach. Well, Commissioner, where is your advice from the Director of Public Prosecutions? You're not the judge, jury and executioner. You are the Police Commissioner. Go and get an advice from the DPP. Or have you asked the court for a guideline judgment? They do it all the time. They make a guideline judgment about drink driving. They make guideline judgments about all areas of law. It is not your call to say, I don't think it amounts to a breach. It is up to the judiciary. And if any young police officer out there listens to this or sees this, I urge you, if you see anti-Semitic behaviour on the street, don't worry about what your Commissioner says. Go and lock them up. Be brave. Have the courage of your convictions. Have the courage to be an Australian and act for all Australians. Take it to court. Make it a test case. Go to the High Court. Be a hero. Be a hero for the Australian people. Be a hero for the Jewish community. Because if you don't, we know the Commissioner won't. The Commissioner won't stand up and enforce these laws. And until somebody does, and Deputy Speaker, I've spoken to magistrates, I've spoken to judges, and I've spoken to police, and they are waiting for the imprimatur for those in charge to do something about this. But their hands are tied. Commissioner, have some courage. Stand in front of your troops and say, we will not stand for this. Mr Albanese, it's too late, and I think this bill's too late. But get on the front foot, election or not, and represent our Jewish communities, represent our Australian people, because that's who they are. They are Australians. And anyone who propagates this evil violence or these evil words need to be locked up for a very long time. And if you're not a citizen, away you go. See you later, you're gone. You don't deserve the benefit of what Australia has. Do not bring your vile, evil ideology to our country and expect to get away with it, because you won't. We need, as a government, to be united. We know we won't get it from the Greens and some of the independents because of their lunacy, but we need to be united as a coalition and Labor and be strong and show these people, show these vile creatures who we are and how tough we can be, and get back to the country that Steve and Joe loved. Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker.
The question is, excuse me, the question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Flinders.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This bill, the Criminal Code Amendment Hate Crimes Bill 2024, amends the Criminal Code Act of 95 to strengthen existing offences for urging force or violence and the display of hate symbols, and to introduce new offences for threatening force or violence against targeted groups and their members. The fault aspect for the existing offences of urging force or violence is also to be reduced from intent to recklessness. The bill also proposes to remove an existing good faith defence from urging force or violence offences and for the proposed threatening force or violence offences. The groups against whom it would be an offence to threaten force or violence would be distinguished by race, religion, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex status, disability, nationality, national or ethnic origin or political opinion. When this bill was introduced in September last year, the Coalition offered to pass the bill with haste, but the government refused. Perhaps if it hadn't, we would not have seen the horror we have seen over summer. I'm nevertheless relieved it is happening in this sitting fortnight, most likely the last sitting fortnight of the 47th Parliament. This is a serious piece of legislation which responds to abhorrent behaviours by evil actors which we have seen growing in incidents in Australia since the atrocities of October 7. On that October 7, Hamas, a recognised terrorist organisation, attacked Israel. 2 days later, we saw the first instance of what, at least to me, seemed to be a fundamental breach of the Australian ethos of equality, acceptance, tolerance and a celebration of our diversity and our heritage and our proud boast of being one of the best multicultural countries in the world. The Sydney Opera sails were lit up with blue and white in recognition of the atrocities Israel had just suffered. And yet there was a protest beneath those sails and anti-Semitic chants were heard. There is debate about what occurred that night, but the images speak for themselves. Watching them, you see an anti-Israel mob setting off flares and chanting death wishes to Jewish Australians. That protest was advertised by the Palestine Action Group on that day, while the murder of Jewish people along the Gaza Strip was still ongoing, and as the 251 hostages of Hamas began what has become, for so many, more than a year in captivity. A day later, Sheikh Ibrahim Dawood addressed a large protest in Lakemba in Western Sydney, and he cried to the crowd, "I'm elated. It's a day of courage. It's a day of resistance. It's a day of pride. It's a day of victory." And that was the beginning. And since then, there has been more than 700% increase in anti-Semitic attacks and anti-Semitic behaviour in this country. As we in the Coalition have raised elsewhere time and time again, the Prime Minister stands condemned for failing to address these matters as and when they occurred. He has been vastly outshone by his New South Wales Premier, whose forcefulness of word and belief demonstrates what could and should be done with a moral compass. Shortly after the October 7 attacks, I travelled to Israel on what I think remains the only bipartisan trip to Israel since the atrocities of that day. The members for McNamara and Higgins attended, along with the member for Fisher, Senators Birmingham and Fawcett. We went to Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, as well as Sderot on the Gaza border, a town that at the time had a population of 3,000, down from 37,000 before the attacks. We visited the kibbutz Kfar Aza to see where the terror of October 7 and the days that followed had begun. We listened to soldiers, parliamentarians, local MPs, people who run civil services for residents, families of hostages, and locals grieving their lost ones. We also met with the Palestinian Authority. I have never encountered so many shades of grief as I saw in that week. There was an overarching desire for peace on all sides, but a recognition that that cannot happen without the disablement of Hamas, a terrorist organisation that is roughly 70 kilometres from the towns of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It's extremely close. You can get there in less than a couple of hours. It's extremely present, and it's a terrorist organisation which, short and simple, will accept nothing less than the eradication of Israel and her people. It was that week while I was in Israel that we saw the Albanese government sending horrendous mixed messages regarding Israel's right to defend herself. While we were there, the Albanese government joined others at the UN General Assembly calling for a ceasefire, along with, almost as an afterthought, the immediate release of hostages. I was with the member for McNamara in the bus late at night, travelling from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, I think. We had just missed rocket alerts and shelter commands in Jerusalem. Josh was in the bus and he took a call and his face went grey. May I say it takes a lot to turn the member for McNamara's face grey. He's one of the most jovial and optimistic blokes in this place, full of grace and often full of giggle. He doesn't go grey well. "Are you okay, buddy?" I asked him. Came the stony response. He put up a good front the next day. He did a fair swathe of media and he was clear and compelling in his description of what we were seeing in Israel. 200,000 people displaced from their homes and the stories of 1,200 people slaughtered over that weekend of 7-8 October. As I have said elsewhere, I commend the member for McNamara's moral clarity and his constant voice for Jewish Australians. Together with the efforts for the member for Barara, they have made this place and this country a better place, reminding us of our better selves, living in not just tolerant, but safe and welcoming country for people of all faiths and backgrounds. But their grace has failed to stem the tide of anti-Semitic acts which have blighted our beautiful country over the last 15 months. The member for McNamara's office was graffitied and burnt in June 2024, putting at risk the life and well-being of his staff and other residents of that building. The Adass Israel Synagogue was burnt to the ground in December 2024. A car in Wallara was set alight and anti-Israel graffiti littered the suburb in November 2024. Same again in Wallara a month later. And then in January of this year, 2 more synagogues were vandalised with swastikas. A childcare centre was set alight, topped off with some more graffiti. The former home of the co-chief executive officer of the Executive Council of Australian Jury was vandalised with red paint, more cars and more graffiti. A school was vandalised with anti-Semitic graffiti. A caravan with explosives was discovered alongside an anti-Semitic note. Earlier this week, eggs were thrown at women in Bondi and Sydney, with Strikeforce Pearl's commander treating the matter as an anti-Semitic attack due to the women's clothes potentially identifying them as targets of that nature. And in recent nights, a home in Middle Park in Melbourne has been defaced with anti-Semitic graffiti. I thank the Executive Council for Australian Jewry for their work tracking and reporting anti-Jewish incidents in Australia in 2024. Their report, the UCAJ report on anti-Jewish incidents in Australia 2014, makes for harrowing reading. Reading it, you will see the incidents I listed above. They don't even scratch the surface of what has been happening in our country. The language used in some of the other incidents described in this report is deeply distressing, like a graffiti of supposed Zionists, a caricature of a man with big ears, a big nose, horns and long witch-like fingers. Physical assaults of Jewish Australians walking in a public park or going to a 7-Eleven, rocks thrown, spitting, bread ball cans thrown out of cars, on gatherers around a synagogue. It's endless, harrowing, compulsory reading. And while I'm grateful for organisations like the Executive Council of Australian Jewry and indeed the Australian Israeli Jewish Affairs Council, who has worked for decades to build Israel awareness in this place and build collaboration and affection between our two countries, I do not necessarily need these reports to know something terrible is happening in this country. In my own electorate of Flinders on the 12th of November in 2023, the day after Remembrance Day, a statue of a World War I soldier, which had been carved into a tree stump, was vandalised with a swastika. The RSL cleaned it up, cut it down, and put the statue behind the walls of the RSL garden where it would be safe. In November 2024, swastikas were spray painted across the main road of Flinders Township and upon the I Am sculpture, which sits beautifully in the centre of town. At various points, swastikas have been painted on the roads or on our Welcome to Township signs. I was even told recently on a visit to the Rosebud Country Club, someone had carved swastikas into the sand bunkers. It's bizarre and it's sick. But beyond the evidence of my electorate is the evidence of my friends.
Order. A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. The member for Flynn is in continuation.
Deputy Speaker, beyond the evidence of anti-Semitism of my electorate is the evidence of my friends. One of my dearest friends lives in Dover Heights, down the road from the attack on the former home of Jewish leader Alex Rifkin. If you need reminding, on 17 January, emergency services were called to Dover Heights when 4 cars were damaged and one graffitied with the words F Israel and another vehicle with F Jews, which was also set alight. At the time, in concern for my friend, I suggested she come and stay with me for a few days, maybe some sun on the Mornington Peninsula to get away from it all. Her response was ferocious. Thanks, Ed, but what I really need is some law enforcement to create a deterrent. The fact that this happened the day after a ceasefire agreement was announced shows that this has little to do with the Middle East and is anti-Semitism pure and simple. I am not hiding, I am angry. After the attacks in Kingsford last weekend, I checked in with her again and she replied, "My family member goes to school there and is already terrified. Last night another family member called in panic to check we were okay as she saw a whole lot of police and ambulances heading in the direction of Dover Heights. At other times she has told me of sleepless nights punctured by the sounds of helicopters overhead. This is Australia. This night terror has no place here." The Prime Minister has chopped and changed in his language about the stark anti-Semitism we have been seeing over the last 15 months. And last week we had the astonishing statement by the Treasurer in response to the discovery of a caravan laden with explosives alongside a list of addresses of Jewish organisations, businesses and homes. On the Today Show last week, the Treasurer said, "What it shows is that the fears that a lot of Australians in the Jewish community have are not always unfounded." Not always unfounded. I know he apologised afterwards, and what a relief that he did. But it hints to you the mistrust this government has towards Australia's Jewish community and the belittling of its well-founded fear of violence. This bill is unfortunately necessary because of the mixed messages from this government, which has allowed hate-free reign. But it's not just the provisions of the bill which matter, it's the use of them, as my friend so rightly pointed out. Anti-Semitic displays must be prosecuted, anti-Semitic protests stopped. Existing laws have not been used. Protests in our streets which anti-Semitic displays have been paraded have dragged on for months. Universities have set up anti-Semitic camps. And while this bill will mitigate some of the government's failures, we can only hope they will be used when existing provisions like the Criminal Code have not been used, like Division 80, which makes it an offence to urge violence against individuals or groups on the basis of race, religion and the like. The Coalition has been calling for action for months. The Executive Council of Australian Jewry has been calling for action for months. The Australia-Israeli Jewish Affairs Council has been calling for action for months. Jewish places of worship and scholarship, Jewish businesses, Jewish schools have been calling for action for months. Jewish families, their friends, my friend, has been calling for action for months. This week we have spent some time in contemplation of the anti-Semitic blight brought upon this beautiful country. Maybe now action will follow.
The time being almost 1 p.m, the Federation Chamber is now suspended until the Chair is resumed at 4 p.m. today.